The night my family tried to steal my life's work, they ordered the priciest Cabernet on my reserve list. I was standing at the expo line, wiping the rim of a warm porcelain plate, holding a blackened redfish over sweet potato puree. The ticket printer chattered in my ear, a rhythmic, mechanical pulse dictating the pace of my kitchen. The air smelled of toasted garlic thyme and the sharp tang of reduced white wine. I am Audrey Ortiz. I built this modern Creole kitchen in Baton Rouge from bare brick and a drained savings account. I am 32 years old, head chef and sole proprietor of Roux and Root. Before I tell you exactly how my own parents attempted a hostile takeover of my business in front of 30 people, tell me your age and what state you are watching from in the comments. Welcome to Intimately Told Stories. Now let me take you back to that Tuesday evening. The dinner service was operating at a flawless rhythm. My brigade moved around me like clockwork, searing proteins, finishing sauces, and plating delicate garnishes. Through the swinging double doors, the main dining room hummed with a different kind of energy. Table 4 had been pushed together, with 3 adjacent tables to form a long banquet setup occupying the center of the floor. My parents, Carlos and Elena, held court there. They were hosting 30 of our extended relatives to celebrate the return of my older brother, Mateo. Mateo had just moved back to Louisiana. His latest logistics startup had quietly folded, bringing him home with empty pockets, a bruised ego, and a desperate need for a new title. My parents had spent weeks planning this welcome dinner. They requested my best tables, my best servers, and a customized tasting menu. I provided it all, assuming they wanted to show off the success of their daughter's restaurant to the rest of the family. I slid the blackened redfish under the heat lamps, tapped the silver bell for the food runner, and turned back to the cutting board. Before I could call the next ticket, the heavy kitchen doors swung open. My mother walked in. She wore a silk emerald blouse and pearl earrings, looking entirely out of place against the stainless steel prep tables and the line cooks covered in flour and grease. Her expression was tight, with a forced, breathless urgency. She stepped right past a server carrying a tray of hot gumbo, grabbed my wrist, and ignored the cornmeal dusting my apron. "You need to come out to the floor right now," she said. Her voice carried a tone that did not invite questions. It was the tone she used when she wanted to present the image of a perfect, unified family to outsiders. "I have a full board, Mom," I replied, gesturing toward the row of white tickets hanging from the rail. "Give me 10 minutes to clear the rush." "No," she insisted, her grip tightening on my arm. "Your father is about to make the toast. It is important that you are standing there. Mateo needs this." I wiped my hands on a fresh side towel, signaled my sous chef to take over the expo station, and followed her out of the kitchen. The transition from the harsh, fluorescent lights of the prep area to the warm, amber glow of the dining room always felt like stepping into a different world. It was a world I had designed. I picked out the custom mahogany chairs. I chose the brass light fixtures. I spent months curating the local art hanging on the exposed brick walls. Every detail belonged to me. I stopped near the main server station, staying out of the direct path of the floor staff. The ambient lighting caught the crystal stems of the wine glasses lining the banquet table. My father stood at the head of the table. He picked up his silver salad fork and tapped the side of his glass. The clear ringing cut through the low chatter of the surrounding diners, demanding immediate silence. He adjusted the lapels of his blazer, adopting the polished, authoritative posture he usually reserved for his business dealings in commercial real estate. He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, as he surveyed the long table of aunts, uncles, and cousins. "Family," he began, his voice projecting easily across the room. "We gather tonight for a special occasion. We gather to celebrate resilience. We gather to celebrate blood." I leaned against the edge of the server station, crossing my arms. I expected a speech about how Mateo was a brilliant entrepreneur who just needed a fresh start. I expected my father to offer generic praise for his son's non-existent business acumen. He spoke about Louisiana tradition. He talked about roots endurance and the legacy that connects our family name to this city. The relatives leaned in, captivated by the performance. My father paused, his eyes sweeping the room, making sure every person was paying attention. He looked at me for a fraction of a second, his gaze sliding past me as if I were just another employee waiting to clear the plates. Then he walked around the table and placed a heavy hand on Mateo's shoulder. Mateo sat up straighter, adjusting his posture to look the part of a serious businessman. "We all know the restaurant business requires vision," my father said, his voice dropping into a register of solemn importance. "It requires a steady hand, a corporate mindset, and the ability to lead a brand into the future. That is why tonight, Elena and I are officially handing the reins of Rue and Root over to Mateo." He squeezed Mateo's shoulder. A new chapter for the Ortiz legacy. The banquet table erupted in applause. The sound hit me like a physical blow. Aunts and uncles cheered, lifting their expensive wine glasses in a unified toast. My cousin, sitting near the end of the table, let out a loud whistle. My mother beamed, wiping a single practiced tear from her cheek. Mateo stood up, buttoning the center button of his jacket. He dipped his head, offering a practiced, humble smile to the crowd. He soaked in the unearned admiration, raising his own glass to acknowledge the applause. I remained anchored beside the point-of-sale terminal. My chest tightened so severely, I could not draw a full breath. The chatter of the restaurant faded into a dull, rushing sound in my ears. I stared at the faces of my family members, watching them clap and celebrate. They were applauding a theft. My parents were standing in the middle of a dining room they did not own, publicly giving away a multi-million-dollar business they did not finance, did not build, and possessed zero legal right to claim. They were treating my life's work as a family asset, a spare toy they could simply hand over to the golden child because his own ventures had failed. The sheer audacity of the moment paralyzed me. I looked at the floorboards I had installed myself. I looked at the menu I had spent 2 years perfecting. I looked at my brother, who had never worked a single day in a commercial kitchen, accepting the role of my superior. The anger that started in my stomach was not hot or explosive. It was cold. It was the freezing, sharp realization that I had spent my entire life trying to earn the respect of people who only saw me as a utility. I did not walk forward to interrupt. I did not yell. I watched my mother lean over and kiss Mateo on the cheek. I watched my father shake his hand. They were operating under the profound delusion that my silence equated to compliance. For years I had kept the peace. For years I had swallowed my pride to maintain the image of a happy family. I paid my own way through culinary school, worked 80-hour weeks and built this empire with my own 2 hands, all while they poured their resources into Mateo's endless string of failures. Standing there, listening to the clinking of glasses and the murmurs of congratulations, the invisible string tying me to their approval finally snapped. I did not need their validation anymore. I did not care about keeping the peace. They thought they could simply erase my ownership with a toast and a glass of wine. They thought I would bow my head and return to the kitchen to cook for my new boss. They were wrong. The applause began to fade into scattered chuckles and murmurs of approval. My father raised his hand palm open, asking for silence so he could finish his performance. He smoothed his tie, a silk piece I had bought him for his birthday 2 years prior, back when I thought generosity might purchase a fraction of his respect. The ambient noise of the restaurant shifted. Silverware clinked against china. A waiter walked past carrying a tray of iced oysters, the crushed ice shifting with a soft crunch. "Now my father said," projecting his voice over the remnants of the cheer, "We all know Audrey has done a wonderful job keeping the kitchen warm." Keeping the kitchen warm. The phrase hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He did not say, "I built a culinary landmark in Baton Rouge." He did not mention the glowing reviews in the local press or the fact that my profit margins had doubled in the last fiscal year, despite inflation. He made me sound like a dutiful housewife tending a domestic stove, stirring a pot, while waiting for the men to return from their real jobs. He gestured toward me, a vague wave of his hand in the direction of the server station. A few relatives turned their heads, offering tight, patronizing smiles. My aunt Elena raised her glass in my direction, as if congratulating me for knowing my place. I did not blink. I kept my spine rigid, my fingernails biting into the fabric of my apron, feeling the familiar burn of injustice settling in my chest. "But this brand is growing fast," my father continued, pivoting his attention back to his son. "And as we look toward franchising, toward securing real investment, we need a different kind of leadership. Frankly, a man should own the business to handle the corporate side of things. Mateo has the boardroom experience. He has the strategic vision to take Rue and Root to the next level." I tasted copper. The sheer, unvarnished sexism of his justification was breathtaking. My 80-hour work weeks, the burns scarring my forearms, the sleepless nights negotiating with produce vendors and navigating local tax codes were being reduced to a mere stepping stone. I was the invisible labor. Mateo was the designated visionary, despite the undeniable fact that every venture he touched turned into a financial crater. In our household, this was the established law of gravity. Boys were destined for executive suites, and girls were expected to provide the support system. When I drafted the initial business plan for this restaurant, sitting at a thrift store desk in my cramped apartment, my mother had asked why I did not just work as a private chef for a nice family. When Mateo pitched a logistics app that had no actual code and no market research, my father emptied a retirement account to fund it. They could not fathom that the daughter they raised to be compliant was operating a highly profitable, fully incorporated entity. To them, I was just playing restaurant until a man stepped in to run the show. Mateo cleared his throat. He reached for his wine glass, holding it near his chest as he prepared to deliver his acceptance speech. He looked around the table, soaking in the adulation. His posture was practically vibrating with unearned triumph. He wore a tailored navy suit that likely cost more than my weekly payroll, bought with the last remnants of whatever loan our parents had co-signed for him. He opened his mouth to speak, likely to offer some hollow promise about honoring our heritage while pushing into new markets. He never got the chance. The sharp, heavy thud of a glass hitting wood echoed from the far end of the room. Beyond the banquet table, sitting in the shadows of the copper-topped bar, was Mr. Landry. He was 60 years old, a third-generation commercial real estate developer, and a man who possessed half the buildings on this block. He wore a faded linen suit, his silver hair neatly combed back. Every Tuesday evening, he sat at the corner stool, ordered a neat bourbon, and read the financial papers in peace. I always made sure the bartender left him alone. Mr. Landry slid off his stool. He carried a thick manila folder under one arm. His leather loafers made no sound on the reclaimed wood floors, but his presence commanded immediate attention. The relatives nearest the bar quieted down, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. The johannial energy of the family gathering hit a sudden invisible wall. My father recognized him instantly. He shifted his stance, puffing out his chest, transforming from the family patriarch into the slick salesman. He stepped away from Mateo and extended his hand toward the older man, flashing a brilliant, practiced smile. "Mr. Landry," my father called out, his tone dripping with a forced, good-old-boy charm. "What a pleasant surprise! I did not realize you were joining us this evening. We would have sent over a bottle." Mr. Landry ignored the extended hand. He stopped at the edge of the banquet table, his pale blue eyes studying my father with the clinical detachment of a man inspecting rust on a pipe. He did not say a word, letting the silence stretch until my father lowered his hand, looking slightly foolish. "We are just having a little family celebration," my father continued, recovering his rhythm quickly. "In fact, your timing is impeccable. As I was just telling the family, my son Matteo is stepping in to take the helm. Moving forward, Matteo will be taking over our lease negotiations. We have some aggressive expansion plans to discuss with you." I watched Mr. Landry's face. My heart hammered against my ribs. For a terrifying, suspended second, a slow smile spread across the older man's weathered features. He nodded, chuckling softly. The sound sent a jolt of panic through my chest. The Louisiana commercial real estate scene was an insular boys' club. Handshakes meant more than contracts, and legacy names carried weight. If Mr. Landry decided he preferred dealing with my father and brother, he could find a loophole to terminate my tenancy. He could refuse to renew. He could side with the patriarchal shift simply because it felt more familiar to him. My mother exhaled a sigh of relief. Matteo stood taller, grinning at the landlord, ready to step into his unearned role. Then Mr. Landry's smile vanished. It did not fade. It snapped shut like a steel trap. The warmth drained from his eyes, leaving behind a cold, hard glare. He did not share their delusion. He operated in a world of hard numbers, executed contracts, and risk assessment. He stepped past my father, ignoring him entirely, and walked directly toward the server station where I stood. He stopped 2 feet away from me. He did not look at Matteo. He did not look at the 30 relatives staring in bewildered silence. He lifted the manila folder and dropped it onto the polished surface of the server station. The slap of heavy paper against wood cracked through the quiet dining room. "Audrey." Mr. Landry said, his voice gravelly and carrying enough volume to ensure every person at table 4 heard him clearly. "I brought the new 5-year lease extension. I need your signature on the bottom of page 4. My father stepped forward, his slick veneer cracking, revealing the panicked entitlement underneath. "Now hold on a minute, Arthur. I just explained the new structure. You need to be dealing with Matteo. We are restructuring the assets." Mr. Landry turned his head slowly. He looked at my father with an expression of profound pity, the kind of look reserved for someone who had lost their grip on reality. "The lease is in her name only," Mr. Landry stated, emphasizing every syllable. "The limited liability company is registered in her name only. The insurance, the liquor license, and the bank guarantees belong exclusively to Audrey." He paused, letting the legal reality wash over the banquet table. The words hung in the air, dismantling the entire narrative my parents had just constructed. "Who told you otherwise?" The question was lethal. My father opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The uncles who had been cheering moments before now exchanged confused, embarrassed glances. My mother pressed her manicured fingers to her lips, staring at the floor. Matteo looked like he had been struck by a falling beam. His unearned triumph evaporated, replaced by a sudden, frantic realization that he was standing in a room full of people, claiming a throne that did not exist. I looked down at the folder. My name was printed across the top label in bold black ink. Audrey Ortiz, sole managing member. I picked up the pen resting beside the terminal. My hand did not shake. I flipped to page 4, scanning the standard clauses I had already reviewed with my attorney weeks ago. I pressed the tip of the pen to the signature line and signed my name, the ink flowing smoothly across the page, anchoring my ownership in irrefutable reality. "There you go, Mr. Landry," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline flooding my system. He took the folder, tucked it under his arm, and gave me a single, respectful nod. "Good evening, Audrey. Keep the kitchen running." He turned and walked out the front doors, the glass shutting behind him with a soft click. I did not look at my parents. I did not look at Matteo. I let them sit in the uncomfortable, humiliating silence of their own making. I turned my back on the entire dining room, pushed through the double doors, and walked back into the heat of my kitchen. The silence in the dining room was profound. It carried a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on the banquet table. Matteo's complexion transformed into a blotchy, mottled crimson. The confident posture he held seconds prior dissolved, leaving his shoulders slumped under the tailored fabric of his expensive suit jacket. My father, desperate to stitch the tearing seams of his performance, forced a dry, hollow laugh that scraped against the quiet room. "We operate as a family unit," my father announced, to the frozen relatives, his voice lacking its previous resonance. "Paperwork is just a formality." Nobody chuckled with him. The celebratory energy evaporated, replaced by the crushing awkwardness of witnessing a public humiliation. Mr. Landry did not offer a polite smile. He handed me a standard black pen. I signed my name on the dotted line of the 5-year lease extension, handed the folder back, and watched the older man turn and walk out the front doors. The illusion of the Ortiz patriarchy lay fractured on the polished mahogany floor. I did not stay to watch them sweep up the pieces. I simply turned on my heel, pushed through the heavy double doors, and returned to the searing heat of my kitchen. For the remainder of the evening, I buried myself in the rhythm of the line. I expedited plates, tasted sauces, and directed the culinary brigade with a sharp, unwavering focus. The chaotic harmony of the kitchen was my sanctuary. Here, merit dictated rank. If a cook burned a batch of roux, they remade it. There were no golden children shielding themselves behind someone else's labor. I poured every ounce of my surging adrenaline into the food, ensuring every dish that left the pass was flawless. Word filtered back from the floor staff that Table 4 had grown remarkably quiet. They skipped the dessert courses and asked for the check early. I paid the bill from my own managerial account, a final silent testament to who truly possessed the authority in this building. Midnight approached. The last patron departed. The dining chairs were flipped onto the tables, and the stainless steel prep stations gleamed under the industrial cleaning lights. The scent of roasted garlic faded, replaced by the sharp tang of citrus floor cleaner. I retreated to my office, a narrow, windowless room tucked behind the dry storage pantry. I sat at my desk, tallying the night's receipts, the glow of the computer monitor illuminating the fatigue settling deep into my bones. The door handle clicked. I did not look up. My father entered first, followed closely by my mother and Matteo. The cramped space immediately felt stifling. They stood in a semicircle around my desk, a united front of wounded pride. I finished entering a numerical value into the spreadsheet, hit save, and finally raised my eyes. I waited. A naive, lingering fraction of my heart expected an apology. I thought the stark reality check delivered by the landlord to their delusion. I thought they might acknowledge the disrespect of attempting to gift my business to a man who had never scrubbed a single sauté pan. Instead, my mother began to weep. It was not a quiet, reflective crying. It was a practiced, theatrical weeping designed to extract guilt. She pulled a folded tissue from her purse and pressed it against her eyes, shaking her head. "How could you do that to us?" she whispered, her voice quivering with indignation. "How could you embarrass your father in front of the entire family?" I leaned back in my office chair. The reversal of reality was staggering. They had attempted a public coup, yet they cast themselves as the victims of my insubordination. I did not say a single word to the dining room. I replied, keeping my tone deliberately flat. The landlord stated a legal fact. "You embarrassed yourselves by claiming ownership of a business you do not own." My father slapped his open palm against the doorframe. The sudden noise made the framed culinary certificates on my wall rattle against the drywall. "We gave you everything," he snapped, his face contorted, with a rigid defensive anger. "We raised you. We supported this little venture of yours by bringing our friends here to eat. We operate as a family." "Matteo needs a win right now, and you know that. You can still run the back of the house. We just needed him to be the face of the brand to secure investors for the next location." You wanted to reduce me to a line cook in my own empire so your son could play executive, I stated, staring directly into his eyes. He is your brother, my mother pleaded, reaching across the desk to touch my hand. I pulled my arm away, letting her fingers grasp empty air. He has had a string of bad luck. He needs the confidence boost. Why must you be so stubborn? Why can you never just share the spotlight? The words echoed in the small office, unlocking a memory I had spent 2 decades trying to bury. The dynamic playing out under the harsh fluorescent bulb was not a new development. It was the foundational blueprint of my childhood. I was 12 years old again. It was Thanksgiving morning. While my friends were outside riding bicycles in the crisp autumn air, I stood on a step stool in my mother's cramped kitchen, peeling potatoes until my knuckles ached. I spent 6 grueling hours navigating the hot oven, timing the roasting turkey, whisking the giblet gravy, and assembling a pecan pie from scratch. I wanted nothing more than to see my parents smile, to hear them acknowledge my effort. I poured my soul into that holiday meal, seeking the validation that always seemed just out of reach. 10 minutes before the extended relatives arrived, Matteo sauntered into the dining room. He was 14, wearing a crisp, button-down shirt my mother had ironed for him. He picked up a handful of silverware and casually dropped forks and knives next to the ceramic plates. He did not fold the linen napkins. He did not align the crystal water glasses. When my parents walked downstairs, they stopped in the doorway. My mother gasped, clasping her hands together in pure delight. She rushed over to Matteo and hugged him tightly. "Look at this beautiful table," she cooed. "Carlos, look at how helpful our son is. Such a responsible young man." My father ruffled Matteo's hair, beaming with paternal pride. I stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping a smudge of flour off my cheek, my 12-year-old heart fracturing silently. They ate the food I labored over, but they praised the boy who merely placed the forks. I blinked the sensory memory of roasted turkey and fading hope, dissipating, returning me to the present reality of my restaurant office. I looked at the 3 adults standing before me, my father fuming with misplaced authority, my mother wielding her tears as a weapon of manipulation, Matteo sulking in the background, waiting for his parents to secure his unearned prize. For 32 years I had craved their validation. I had assumed that if I just worked harder, cooked better, built something undeniable, they would eventually look at me with the same reverent pride they reserved for Matteo. I thought my relentless success would force them to respect me. Sitting in my office, watching them demand I surrender my greatest achievement to soothe a bruised male ego, the internal conflict that had defined my life shattered into dust. The lingering hope died, replaced by a crystalline, icy clarity. They would never respect me. They did not view me as a daughter, they viewed me as a resource. My achievements were only valuable if they could be harvested and reassigned to the chosen heir. "Get out," I said quietly. My mother gasped, lowering the tissue from her dry eyes. "Audrey, you cannot speak to us like this. I said get out of my office." I stood up, planting my hands flat on the desk, leaning forward. "You will not take my title. You will not take my lease. This conversation is over. Leave my restaurant." My father's jaw clenched. He pointed a rigid finger at my face. "You are making a terrible mistake, Audrey. You turn your back on family, you lose everything." He spun around and marched down the hallway. My mother shot me a look of profound disappointment before following his heavy footsteps. Matteo lingered for a second. He refused to meet my gaze, his eyes darting to the floorboards before he turned and hurried after our parents. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the quiet office. The confrontation was over, but the adrenaline rushing through my veins refused to settle. My father's parting threat echoed in my mind. You turn your back on family, you lose everything. They possessed an arrogant, unchecked sense of entitlement. If they were willing to orchestrate a public ambush to claim my business, they would not simply walk away because I told them to. They would look for another avenue. They would search for a back door to force my compliance. I sank back into my chair, my eyes drifting toward the gray metal filing cabinet resting in the corner of the room. A cold, sinking dread began to pool in my stomach. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The lease was secure. The operating agreement was ironclad, but years ago, when I was young, desperate, and reliant on their approval, I had made a fatal administrative error. An error I had buried and forgotten about until this exact, terrifying moment. To understand the absolute delusion that fueled my family that night, you have to peer beneath the polished surface of our public image and examine the invisible scaffolding of my life. In the Ortiz household, the roles were assigned at birth. Mateo was the heir. I was the utility. The contrast in our treatment was woven into the fabric of our upbringing, but it became glaringly obvious when we entered adulthood. When Mateo turned 24, he pitched an idea for a tech startup that promised to revolutionize local food delivery. He had no coding experience, no market research, and no actual product. He simply had a sleek PowerPoint presentation and the unearned confidence of a favored son. My father sat at the mahogany dining table, reviewed the slides for less than 10 minutes, and liquidated a significant portion of his retirement portfolio to write my brother a seed check. That company collapsed in 18 months. Mateo never launched the app. He did, however, lease a downtown corner office with custom furniture and purchase a German sports car he claimed was necessary for entertaining clients. When the money ran dry, my parents did not demand repayment. My father patted him on the back and told him that early failures were simply the tuition fees for future billionaires. Next came a cryptocurrency mining phase that left my parents footing exorbitant electricity bills for servers humming in their basement. Then followed a boutique logistics firm that consisted of 2 rented box trucks sitting idle in a gravel lot until they were repossessed. Every misstep was cushioned. Every financial crater was filled with our parents' savings. Mateo faced 0 consequences. My path was forged in boiling water and grease. I moved to New York for culinary school. I woke up at 4 in the morning to butcher sides of beef in freezing walk-in coolers. I rode the subway home smelling like rendered fat and sanitizing solution, falling asleep standing up. During my second semester, I faced a tuition shortfall. I called my father asking for a small loan to cover the gap. He declined. He told me I needed to learn the value of $1, suggesting that if I could not afford the program, perhaps the kitchen was not my true calling. So I learned the value of $1. I took double shifts at a loud, chaotic brasserie. I lived in an apartment the size of a walk-in closet. I saved cash in a plain white envelope taped to the underside of my mattress. 4 years later, I returned to Baton Rouge with a scarred forearm, a rolled canvas of Japanese steel knives, and a relentless vision for modern Creole cuisine. I found the perfect location on a dilapidated corner. The building had exposed brick walls, high tin ceilings, and a soul that just needed polishing. I drew up the blueprints. I wrote a meticulous 50-page business plan. But transforming an empty shell into roux and root required serious capital. I walked into a commercial bank when I was 26 years old. I sat across from a loan officer with a pristine posture and a skeptical eye. He reviewed my prospectus. The numbers were solid. The market analysis was bulletproof. However, the Small Business Administration loan application hit a singular snag. My personal credit history was too thin. I lacked the required decade of financial footprint to secure a loan of that magnitude on my own. The bank required a guarantor. I had no choice. I drove to my father's commercial real estate office, swallowed my pride, and laid the paperwork on his desk. He did not read the financial projections. He did not ask about my menu or my target demographic. He agreed to co-sign because the act fed his ego. It allowed him to play the benevolent patriarch, the man making his daughter's little dream possible. The bank's terms were standard but specific. As a financial guarantor, the institution required my father to be listed as a secondary authorized signer on the primary business operating account. The loan officer explained it was a safety measure for the lender, ensuring the guarantor had visibility and access in case the primary debtor defaulted. We signed the documents in thick black ink. I opened the doors to Ruin Root 6 months later. I worked 100-hour weeks. During the first quarter, I slept on 50-pound bags of flour in the dry storage room because driving home took too much time away from prep. I poured every cent of early profit back into the principal. I amortized the debt with ruthless, calculated efficiency. In 36 months, I walked back into that same bank branch and handed the teller a final cashier's check. The loan was dead. The lien on my equipment was lifted. I celebrated by sitting on the back loading dock in the humid Louisiana night, drinking a cheap beer by myself. The following morning, I took the original banking mandate, shoved it into a manila envelope, and buried it in the bottom drawer of my gray office filing cabinet. I assumed the cleared debt severed the tether. I trusted my bloodline. I made the fatal administrative error of failing to file the specific removal forms with the branch manager, because I spent my evenings sweating over a blistering grill in a stained chef coat, and my parents spent their Friday nights sitting at my finest corner booth, sipping imported wine and greeting my regular patrons. They constructed a fantasy. They convinced themselves my physical labor was merely the engine room powering their luxury cruise liner. Because they saw my father's name on a piece of paper 3 years ago, they believed the restaurant was a family asset. They truly thought they could harvest my success and reassign it to the heir who had squandered everything else. Now the adrenaline from the dining room confrontation began to recede, leaving a cold, sinking clarity in its wake. I sat in the stillness of my office, listening to the faint hum of the refrigeration units humming through the drywall. My father's parting threat echoed in the quiet space. You turn your back on family, you lose everything. He was a humiliated man. He had been stripped of his authority in front of 30 relatives by a landlord who refused to play his game. A man like Carlos Ortiz, driven by pride and a fragile ego, would not simply walk away and accept defeat. He would look for a back door. He would search for a way to assert dominance and force my compliance. My eyes drifted downward, locking onto the bottom drawer of the gray filing cabinet. The secondary authorization. The realization wrapped around my throat like a cold hand cutting off my air. The loan was paid off, but the account structure had never been updated. My father was still legally listed as a secondary signer on the primary operating ledger. He had the power to walk into any branch, present his driver's license, and execute transactions. I lunged forward, grabbing the computer mouse. I woke up the screen and opened a new browser tab. My fingers slipped on the keys as I typed in the commercial banking URL. The battle at Table 4 was just theater. The real war was sitting in a database downtown, and I had left the gates wide open. Dawn broke over Baton Rouge, painting the sky a bruised, sluggish purple. The heavy humidity pressed against the frosted glass of my office window, blurring the streetlights outside. I sat alone in the quiet, the industrial air conditioning humming a steady metallic drone. I had not slept a single minute since my family vacated the premises. The adrenaline from the dining room ambush had burned off hours ago, leaving behind a hollow, aching fatigue in my joints. Yet my mind raced with razor-sharp precision. The realization that my father still held secondary authorization on my primary operating ledger hung over me like a guillotine. I pulled my laptop closer, the hinges stiff in the cool air. The screen glowed, casting a harsh blue light across my tired face. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. A part of me hesitated. Ignorance offered a fleeting comfort. Pressing enter meant confirming that the people who raised me viewed my livelihood as a communal trough. I took a slow, deliberate breath, inhaling the lingering scent of floor sanitizer and old paper, and typed in the web address for my commercial banking portal. The login screen appeared. I entered my credentials, retrieved the two-factor authentication code from my phone, and hit submit. The loading wheel spun. Each rotation felt like an eternity. The dashboard materialized, displaying the balances of my payroll tax holding and primary operating accounts. The overall number looked healthy at a glance. We were in the middle of our busy season, hosting private corporate events alongside packed dinner services. Revenue was flowing. But aggregate numbers lie. They hide the hemorrhages beneath a layer of incoming deposits. I needed to dissect the ledger line by line. I clicked the drop-down menu, filtered the transaction history for the past 90 days, and began the audit. The screen populated with rows of familiar expenses: a debit to the linen supply company, a scheduled payment to the local produce collective, the bi-weekly payroll withdrawal, routine charges for municipal utilities, and grease trap maintenance. I scrolled down, my eyes tracking the columns, searching for anything out of rhythm with my standard operations. Halfway down the page for the month of October, my gaze snagged on a single line item. It was an outgoing wire transfer for $5,000. My stomach plummeted. I do not send wire transfers. My vendors require certified checks or automated clearinghouse drafts. I clicked the line item to expand the details. The destination was an external entity listed under a generic acronym, Apex Strategic Partners LLC. The memo line read, Consulting Retainer. I leaned closer to the screen, my pulse thrumming in my ears. I opened a new browser tab, navigated to the Louisiana Secretary of State Business Registry, and typed in the acronym. The database took a moment to load before displaying the corporate filing. The registered agent and sole officer of Apex Strategic Partners was Mateo Ortiz. The breath caught in my throat. I switched back to the banking tab and scrolled faster, my eyes scanning the November ledger. There it was. A second outgoing wire transfer, $7,500. The destination was the same holding company. The memo line read, Marketing Expansion. I scrolled into the current month of December. A third wire transfer initiated just 5 days ago. $6,000. Memo line, Brand Development. I pulled a calculator across the desk and tapped the numbers into the keypad. $18,500. Gone. Siphoned straight from the lifeblood of my restaurant. To generate 18 grand in pure liquid cash in the hospitality industry requires moving mountains. It means flipping hundreds of tables, negotiating pennies on wholesale Gulf shrimp, and minimizing food waste down to the ounce. It represents countless hours standing over open flames, enduring burns, and sacrificing every holiday weekend and evening to ensure the dining room operates flawlessly. My father had taken that labor, digitized it, and handed it to a son who had never worked a hard day in his adult life. I sat back in my chair, staring at the ceiling tiles. The mechanics of a theft became agonizingly clear. My father knew I managed the finances digitally, receiving push notifications for any online transfers or debit card purchases. He bypassed the modern security infrastructure by exploiting the analog past. He had physically walked into the local bank branch down the street. He likely wore a sharp suit, shook hands with the tellers, and leveraged the legacy paperwork sitting in their physical filing cabinets. He authorized the wires in person, signing the slips with a familiar flourish, playing the role of the benevolent patriarch, managing his daughter's growing enterprise. He stole my money with a smile and a firm handshake. The puzzle pieces from the welcome dinner clicked into a devastating, cohesive picture. Mateo's sudden return to Louisiana was not a retreat. It was a calculated deployment. The tailored navy suit he wore last night, the expensive haircut, the arrogant posture at the head of table 4 were all financed by my crawfish étouffée and blackened redfish. They had orchestrated the dinner party ambush because they needed to legitimize the theft. They intended to publicly declare Matteo the new head of Rue and Root, so that when the missing funds were eventually discovered during tax season, they could frame it as authorized corporate restructuring. They expected me to simply accept the narrative, to bow my head and absorb the financial blow, to protect the family image. They thought I would be too embarrassed or too compliant to challenge them. The betrayal ran deeper than a stolen title. They were actively dismantling my financial security to construct a fake throne for the golden child. I looked back at the screen, the glaring red numbers mocking my years of relentless discipline. A profound, icy shift occurred within my chest. The lingering sorrow, the lifelong craving for my parents' validation, the inherent desire to be a dutiful daughter, all of it, calcified. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and retrieved a fresh lined legal pad. I placed it next to my keyboard and clicked my pen. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a luxury for victims, and I refused to play that role. My family had declared war weeks before I even realized I was standing on a battlefield. They assumed they were fighting the obedient, eager-to-please girl who cooked their Thanksgiving dinners and craved a simple pat on the head. They severely underestimated the woman who built a culinary empire from nothing. I started writing. First on the list was securing the perimeter. The bank branch opened at 8 in the morning. I needed my original articles of organization, my operating agreement, proving I was the sole member of the limited liability company, and my federal employer identification number. I gathered the heavy binders from the credenza behind me, stuffing them into my leather briefcase. Second on the list was physical security. My father still possessed a spare key to the back alley loading door, given to him years ago for emergencies. Matteo had likely already made a copy. The thought of them walking into my kitchen while I was away sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through my veins. I opened a search engine and found the number for a 24-hour commercial locksmith. Third was the digital infrastructure. The point-of-sale system, the reservation software, and the payroll platform all required immediate password resets. I could not leave a single back door unlocked. I checked the clock on the wall. It was 5:30 in the morning. The sun was just beginning to cast a pale gray light over the empty streets of Baton Rouge. The city was waking up, unaware of the silent, vicious corporate dispute brewing inside the walls of its favorite Creole kitchen. I closed my laptop and slid it into my briefcase alongside the legal binders. I grabbed my keys from the desk. My parents believed they could walk into my world, take what they wanted, and dictate my future. They relied on the assumption that family ties would bind my hands and silence my objections. They were about to learn a harsh lesson in commercial law and self-preservation. I locked the office door behind me, the mechanical click sounding like the chambering of a round. The time for keeping the peace had expired. It was time to build a fortress. I did not pick up my phone to demand an explanation. I did not text my mother to rage about the betrayal, nor did I call my brother to hurl accusations. An executive chef does not scream when a grease fire erupts on the line. She extinguishes the oxygen, cuts the fuel source, and evaluates the damage. The time for emotional confrontation had passed the moment my father signed that first wire transfer slip. I gathered my legal binders, locked the office door, and stepped out into the humid gray morning of Baton Rouge. My first objective was the financial perimeter. The local branch of my commercial bank sat in a nondescript brick building a few miles away. I pulled into the parking lot exactly at 8 o'clock, waiting for the manager to unlock the glass double doors. I walked straight to the commercial services desk. The junior banker, a young woman who recognized me from weekly deposit runs, smiled warmly. I did not return the smile. I set my heavy leather briefcase on her desk. I need to execute an immediate restructuring of my operating accounts, I told her, my voice clipped and devoid of pleasantries. I produced my articles of organization, my operating agreement designating me as the sole managing member of the limited liability company, and the federal assignment of my employer identification number. I presented my driver's license and laid out the printed ledgers highlighting the $18,500 in stolen funds. The banker's eyes widened as she scanned the highlighted wire transfers. These were authorized in person by Carlos Ortiz, she noted, her tone shifting to professional concern. He is listed as a secondary signer on the primary account. Not anymore, I stated, sliding a formal revocation of authorization form across the desk. I am legally severing his access effective immediately. Furthermore, I am flagging those 3 outgoing wires as unauthorized commercial fraud. The banker tapped rapidly on her keyboard, her screen reflecting in her glasses. The process took 45 agonizing minutes. We closed the legacy account entirely. We opened a new primary operating ledger with a newly generated routing number. We transferred the remaining capital, isolating the funds behind a fresh layer of digital security. When I walked out of the bank, the financial pipeline feeding Mateo's fake corporate takeover was permanently severed. My father could walk into that lobby demanding access all he wanted. He would find nothing but an empty vault and a revoked mandate. My second objective was physical security. My father possessed a spare key to the back alley loading door. He had carried it on his keyring for 3 years, a supposed safety measure for emergencies. I knew Mateo had likely already made a copy for himself, anticipating his grand entrance as the new CEO. The thought of them walking into my pristine kitchen, touching my equipment, and barking orders at my prep cooks made my blood simmer. I sat in my car and dialed a 24-hour commercial locksmith I had used when a delivery driver accidentally backed into our side entrance a year ago. The dispatcher promised a technician within the hour. I arrived back at Ruined Route just as the locksmith's van pulled into the alley. For the next 3 hours, I shadowed him as he dismantled the old hardware. By 2 in the afternoon, the front vestibule, the rear loading dock, and the interior office doors were all outfitted with new, high-security deadbolts that could not be duplicated at a standard hardware store. The locksmith handed me a small envelope containing the new master set. I held the heavy brass keys in my palm. They were cold, sharp, and weighty. For 32 years, I had operated under the assumption that family meant open doors, shared resources, and unconditional access. The keys in my hand represented a profound shift. They were a physical severing of the umbilical cord to a toxic lineage. I was no longer the obedient daughter attempting to earn a place at their table. I was the architect of my own fortress, and I alone controlled who crossed the threshold. My third objective was the digital infrastructure. The modern restaurant operates on a web of integrated software. The point-of-sale system, the reservation platform, and the payroll processing dashboard all held sensitive data and operational control. I returned to my office and initiated a ruthless digital purge. I reset every master password. I revoked the guest wireless access. I wiped the old administrative profiles, ensuring that even if Mateo managed to guess a legacy password, he would find himself locked out of the system's back end. By 4 in the afternoon, the perimeter was entirely secure. My prep cooks began arriving for the evening shift, tying on their aprons and firing up the ranges. The familiar rhythm of the kitchen resumed, completely detached from the silent war I had just waged. I sat in my office monitoring the security camera feeds on my computer monitor. At 4:30, a sleek black sedan pulled into the side parking lot. My father stepped out of the driver's side wearing a crisp, casual suit. Mateo emerged from the passenger side. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm, looking every inch the young executive ready to assume command. They walked confidently toward the back alley loading door, entirely oblivious to the reality that their reign had ended before it began. I watched the monochrome footage on my screen. My father reached into his pocket and produced his keyring. He selected the old brass key and handed it to Matteo, a symbolic passing of the torch. Matteo stepped up to the heavy steel door. He slid the key into the cylinder. He attempted to turn it. The mechanism did not yield. He pulled the key out, inspected the teeth, and slid it back in, applying more pressure. The deadbolt remained perfectly, stubbornly locked. Matteo jiggled the handle, his frustration visible even through the grainy security footage. He looked back at my father, shaking his head. My father frowned, stepping forward to try the key himself. He yanked on the handle, his shoulders tensing as the heavy door refused to budge. The arrogant, triumphant energy they carried into the alley evaporated, replaced by a sudden, jarring confusion. They realized they were locked out. Matteo stepped back from the door. He raised his foot and kicked the steel panel in a brief, childish display of temper. The impact echoed faintly through the brick walls of my office. Seconds later, the cell phone resting on my desk began to vibrate. The screen illuminated, displaying my father's name. The buzzing sound vibrated against the wood, persistent and demanding. I did not reach for it. I sat perfectly still, watching the screen light up, go dark, and immediately light up again as Matteo's name appeared. The Ortiz men were accustomed to immediate compliance. They expected me to answer the phone, apologize for the inconvenience, and rush to open the door for them. They expected the obedient utility daughter to smooth over their path. I ignored the call. I watched the security feed as my father pulled his phone from his ear, his face darkening with anger. He pointed a rigid finger at the security camera mounted above the door, mouthing words I did not need audio to understand. They were furious. They were humiliated. They thought they could simply take my life's work, steal my operating capital, and walk into my building to claim the spoils. But the locks were changed. The money was moved, and the daughter they relied on to be weak had finally learned how to fight back. My father turned sharply on his heel, marching back toward his sedan. Matteo followed close behind his leather portfolio, looking suddenly ridiculous under his arm. The black car reversed out of the lot, tires peeling against the asphalt in a frustrated exit. The immediate threat was repelled, but the victory brought no relief. The swift, aggressive nature of their retreat meant they were retreating to regroup. If they could not breach the physical doors, they would attempt to dismantle the business from the outside. A restaurant is an ecosystem reliant on a fragile web of external relationships. I knew exactly where Matteo would strike next. He would aim for the supply chain. The Wednesday morning prep shift is the beating heart of any successful weekend service. By 8 o'clock, the kitchen is already a symphony of controlled chaos. The exhaust hoods roar to life, pulling the heat from the heavy iron ranges. My line cooks stand shoulder to shoulder, breaking down whole chickens, peeling mountains of garlic and reducing veal stock into rich, dark demi-glace. The air smells of toasted mirepoix and hot butter. But all of this intricate labor relies on one fragile, foundational element: the supply chain. In the hospitality industry, your relationship with your purveyors is your lifeline. You can possess the finest culinary technique in the world, but if your walk-in cooler is empty, you have no menu. If you have no menu, you have no revenue. At 9:15, my cell phone vibrated against the stainless steel prep table. The caller ID displayed the name of my primary Gulf seafood distributor, a seasoned veteran named Leon, who managed a fleet of refrigerated trucks operating out of New Orleans. Leon and I had built a solid relationship over the past 4 years. I paid my invoices on time, and he ensured I received the first pick of the morning catch. I wiped my hands on a side towel and answered the call, expecting him to tell me about a delay on the interstate or a shortage of blue crab. Instead, Leon sounded hesitant. His voice lacked its usual booming cheerfulness. He asked if I was currently at the restaurant. I confirmed that I was standing on the line. He paused for a moment, the sound of a roaring diesel engine humming in the background of the call. He told me he had a very confusing dispatch ticket in his hand. Late yesterday afternoon, a man claiming to be the new managing director of Rue and Root had contacted their central office. This man instructed the logistics team to redirect my entire Wednesday seafood order to a different address. Leon read the address aloud. It was a commercial warehouse located in an industrial park on the far outskirts of Baton Rouge, miles away from my kitchen. The man on the phone told my distributor that Rue and Root was undergoing immediate management restructuring. He claimed the restaurant was temporarily closed for renovations, and all fresh inventory needed to be routed to this new holding facility for processing. The order included 500 pounds of whole red snapper, 3 dozen sacks of premium oysters, and 50 pounds of jumbo Gulf shrimp. It was the lifeblood of my upcoming Friday night service. I leaned against the prep table, staring at the white subway tile on the wall. The sheer audacity of the tactic crystallized in my mind. Failing to gain physical entry to my building, Matteo had decided to escalate the conflict by attacking my supply chain. He was laying siege to my restaurant. Matteo understood the mechanics of a dinner rush well enough to know that a seafood menu without seafood is a death sentence. If I could not feed my reservations, the local food critics and loyal patrons would witness a spectacular failure. He wanted to starve my kitchen. He wanted to break my spirit and create a panic so severe that I would be forced to call him and negotiate. He intended to hold my own inventory hostage, using the stolen $18,000 to rent that ghost warehouse so he could play the role of a powerful executive holding all the cards. I did not raise my voice. I did not express outrage to the man on the phone. I thanked Leon for his diligence and instructed him to hold his trucks at the dock for exactly 10 minutes. I walked away from the prep line and unlocked my secured office. I did not dial my brother's number to argue. Engaging in a screaming match validates the delusion that there is a debate to be had. Matteo wanted a fight because fighting implies equal footing. I refused to grant him that status. He was an interloper, playing a dangerous game with federal tax laws and commercial credit lines. I sat at my desk and opened my email client. In the restaurant business, you cannot purchase thousands of dollars of wholesale product on a handshake. You operate on net 30 credit terms, which means the vendor extends you a line of credit based on your financial history and legal standing. Matteo was attempting to reroute thousands of dollars of highly perishable goods that were being billed directly to my Social Security number and my corporate entity. I drafted a sterile, precise message to the ownership and legal department of the seafood distribution company. I did not mention family drama or sibling rivalry. The corporate world does not care about your personal grievances. It only cares about liability. I attached a series of crisp digital files to the email. The first was a scanned copy of my state liquor license. The second was my current health department operating permit. The third was my official Internal Revenue Service document displaying my federal employer identification number. Every single piece of paper bore one name and one name only: Audrey Ortiz. In the body of the email, I stated clearly that any individual attempting to redirect inventory purchased under my established credit terms without my written authorization was committing commercial fraud. I clarified that a man named Matteo Ortiz possessed zero legal affiliation, zero equity, and zero operational authority within my limited liability company. I concluded by noting that any goods delivered to the unauthorized warehouse address would be reported as stolen, and the invoices would be legally contested. I hit send. I did not stop there. My seafood was secure, but my menu also relied heavily on seasonal produce. I picked up the phone and dialed Emile, a second-generation farmer who supplied my heirloom tomatoes, crisp mirlitons, and fresh herbs. Emile answered from his tractor, the sound of the wind rushing against the microphone. I asked him if anyone had called to alter my delivery schedule. Emile sighed, confirming my suspicion. He said a smooth-talking guy called at sunrise, requesting the weekly harvest be dropped at an industrial loading dock. Emil was confused because he knew I inspected every single tomato myself before it entered my walk-in cooler. I explained that a fraudulent actor was attempting to disrupt my business. I sent Emil the same legal documentation securing my farm-to-table route with undeniable proof of ownership. 10 minutes later, my cell phone vibrated again. It was Leon. The tone of his voice had shifted from hesitant to strictly business. He had received my email and forwarded it to his general manager. The response was immediate and decisive. Leon informed me that the warehouse address had been permanently blacklisted in their logistics system. His delivery trucks were currently rolling down the interstate heading straight for my back alley loading dock. Mateo's grand corporate maneuver crumbled the second it collided with actual business compliance. He had relied on the unearned confidence that carried him through our family dynamic, assuming he could simply talk his way into controlling a commercial supply chain. He learned a very hard lesson about the real world. You cannot run a logistics network on inherited entitlement and a tailored suit. You need the paper to back it up. You need to hold the actual liability. By noon, the delivery trucks arrived. I stood on the loading dock, signing the invoices and watching my prep cooks haul heavy boxes of crushed ice and fresh snapper into the coolers. The rhythm of the restaurant remained entirely unbroken. We were fully stocked, prepared to execute a flawless service. Mateo was left standing in an empty, rented warehouse, surrounded by concrete walls and silence. He had no product, no staff, and no power. His attempt to choke my operations had been dismantled not by emotional pleading, but by bureaucratic precision. But a man who feels his unearned authority slipping away does not simply surrender. The realization that he could not beat me on paper or in the physical realm of business operations meant he had to change the battlefield entirely. If he could not break my business from the inside, he would try to destroy my reputation from the outside. As I finished inspecting the last crate of oysters, my phone screen lit up with a notification from a social media application indicating I had been tagged in a new public video. The screen of my phone illuminated against the stainless steel prep table, vibrating with a rapid succession of alerts. I had just finished logging the morning inventory, the chill of the walk-in cooler still clinging to my chef coat. The notifications were not from vendors or reservation platforms. They were tags on a social media application. I tapped the glass, unlocking the device, and a video immediately began to autoplay. Mateo filled the frame. He stood outside the corrugated metal roll-up doors of the empty industrial warehouse he had rented with my stolen capital. The overcast afternoon sky cast a gray, cinematic gloom over his shoulders. He looked remarkably disheveled, a calculated departure from his usual tailored perfection. His collar was unbuttoned, his hair slightly rumpled, and he stared into the lens with the hollow, defeated eyes of a martyr. He held the camera at a slight downward angle, creating an intimate, confessional atmosphere. He took a deep, shaky breath before speaking. For the past 12 months, Mateo began, his voice thick with rehearsed emotion. I have poured my soul into designing the next chapter of our family legacy. I spent countless nights doing market research, sourcing sustainable purveyors, and drafting the operational blueprint to expand Ruined Root into a regional brand. I leaned against the prep table, my jaw tightening, as the sheer fabrication poured through the tiny speaker. He had never once looked at a profit and loss statement for my kitchen. He did not even know the name of my primary seafood distributor until he tried to hijack the delivery route earlier that morning. I secured this warehouse, Mateo continued, gesturing to the barren concrete structure behind him. I laid the groundwork, I built the infrastructure, and this morning I arrived to find the locks changed and my access revoked. My own sister waited until the foundation was poured, and then she shut the door in my face. She claimed my intellectual property as her own and locked me out of the very expansion I designed. It is a hard truth to swallow when greed poisons your own bloodline. The video ended, looping back to the beginning. The view count was already climbing into the thousands. Before I could even process the magnitude of the lie, my phone chimed again. My mother had shared the video to her own timeline. She attached a long, lamenting caption. "A mother should never have to watch her children tear each other apart," she wrote. "My heart breaks seeing my son's dreams crushed by the selfishness of his own flesh and blood. We raised our kids to share, to support one another. Please keep our family in your thoughts during this painful betrayal." The floodgates opened. The digital onslaught was swift and merciless. My phone vibrated endlessly as text messages and direct messages poured in from extended relatives, family friends, and people I had not spoken to since high school. Cousin Leo sent a block of text. "How could you do this to him after everything your parents did to support your little cooking hobby? You owe your entire career to their backing." Aunt Maria chimed in minutes later. "Money changes people. You should be ashamed of yourself for stealing your brother's hard work. We all know he is the one with the business degree." The physical reaction hit me in a wave of searing heat. My pulse hammered in my temples. The visceral, overwhelming urge to hit the record button and broadcast the unvarnished truth clawed at my throat. I wanted to scream into the camera. I wanted to post the bank ledgers showcasing the $18,000 siphoned from my operating account. I wanted to publish the SBA loan documents proving I carried the financial risk alone for 3 years. I wanted to strip away the facade and show the world the parasitic reality of the Ortiz patriarchy. My thumb hovered over the reply icon. Then I stopped. The discipline forged by years of running a high-pressure commercial kitchen took over. You do not throw water on a grease fire. You smother it. Engaging in a public shouting match was a trap. It would reduce a documented case of commercial fraud into a messy he-said-she-said family feud. The court of public opinion is fickle, driven by emotion and theatrics. Mateo thrived in that arena because he possessed endless charisma and zero substance. But the legal system operates on a different frequency. A judge does not care about social media sympathy. A judge cares about paper trails, time-stamped ledgers, and copyright filings. I closed the social media application and opened my cloud storage drive. I created a new encrypted folder and titled it Evidence. I downloaded Mateo's broadcast in the highest resolution available, preserving his face and his specific claims of intellectual property ownership. I took precise screenshots of my mother's defamatory caption. I captured every hateful text message from my relatives, ensuring the sender's contact information was clearly visible. I filed every digital stone they threw into the secure vault. They were throwing a public tantrum, oblivious to the fact that they were handing my attorney a pristine, documented trail of libel and malicious intent. Let them spin their tragic narrative. I would let them dig the hole as deep as they desired, knowing I possessed the legal deed to the shovel. I silenced my phone, slipping it into the pocket of my chef coat. The digital noise faded, returning my focus to the physical reality of my restaurant. Mateo was pivoting. His attempt to breach the physical doors had failed. His attempt to choke the supply chain had collapsed. The smear campaign was designed to isolate me, to make me feel so universally despised that I would surrender the keys just to stop the bleeding. But a restaurant is not a solo endeavor. It is an organism. Mateo still needed a crew to run a hospitality empire. If he could not steal my building or my inventory, the next logical target was my human capital. He would come for my staff. I walked out of the prep area and stepped into the quiet dining room. It was 3 p.m, the sacred quiet hour between the lunch rush and the dinner service. The afternoon light filtered through the front windows, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany tables. I asked the hostess to gather the entire front and back-of-house staff. Within 10 minutes, 25 people filed into the dining room. My line cooks stood near the bar, their aprons pristine and white. The waitstaff slid into the leather booths. They looked at me with quiet expectation, sensing a shift in the usual pre-shift routine. I stood at the head of the center table, holding a stack of crisp, cream-colored folders. I looked at Elias, my stoic sous chef, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with me through countless Friday night rushes. I looked at Camille, my general manager, whose flawless execution of the floor kept the dining room humming like a finely tuned engine. These people were not just employees. They were the actual foundation of Rue and Root. We are entering a new phase of profitability. I began keeping my voice even and calm. When a brand experiences the kind of growth we have seen over the past 4 quarters, the standard industry move is to open a second location. The standard move is to spread the talent thin, dilute the brand, and chase rapid expansion. I paused, walking down the aisle, placing a folder in front of Elias, then Camille, and continuing down the line until every staff member held one. I am not interested in the standard move, I continued. I am interested in fortifying the foundation. The success of this kitchen does not belong to a corporate holding company. It belongs to the hands that sear the steaks, the voices that guide the guests, and the discipline that keeps this building running. I instructed them to open the folders. The rustle of heavy paper filled the dining room. Inside those covers, you will find an updated compensation agreement, I explained, watching their eyes scan the text. Effective today, every senior staff member receives a 10% increase in base salary. More importantly, you will find a binding quarterly profit-sharing contract. A percentage of the net revenue generated by this restaurant will be distributed directly to you every 3 months. As long as Rue and Root remains profitable, you share in the equity of that success. The silence in the room stretched heavy with disbelief. In the hospitality sector, profit sharing for floor staff and line cooks is virtually unheard of. It is an industry built on thin margins and high turnover. Elias looked up from his contract, his dark eyes locking onto mine. He did not smile, but the subtle nod of his chin communicated a profound, unspoken loyalty. Camille pressed her hand over her mouth, reading the projected dividend numbers at the bottom of the page. I did not mention my brother. I did not mention the stolen $18,000, the changed locks, or the viral smear campaigns circulating on the internet. I did not need to burden my team with the toxicity of my bloodline. I simply bound them to my vision with the strongest adhesive known to the commercial world. I aligned their financial future directly with my own. Take the contracts home, I told them, stepping back toward the kitchen doors. Have a lawyer read them if you prefer. Bring them back signed whenever you are ready. Now, let us get prepped for dinner. We have a fully booked house tonight. The staff dispersed, a renewed electric energy buzzing through the room. They returned to their stations not just as employees, but as stakeholders. I returned to my office and sat at my desk. Matteo was out there relying on his charisma and a fake title to build his empire. He was preparing to approach my people armed with empty promises and borrowed money. He had no idea he was walking into a fortress of absolute contracted loyalty. I had just checkmated his next move before he even placed his hand on the piece. The Thursday morning air hung heavy with the scent of roasted chicory and damp asphalt. A brief, sudden thunderstorm had washed the Baton Rouge streets, leaving the sidewalks glistening under the pale morning sun. I stood at the host stand near the front entrance, nursing a ceramic cup of black coffee. The dining room was quiet, caught in the still hours before the prep cooks arrived to ignite the ranges. I enjoyed this specific silence. It offered a clean slate, a brief window where the restaurant belonged only to me, free from the demands of patrons and the chaos of a busy service. Through the glass panes of the front door, I watched the postal carrier pull his white truck to the curb. He grabbed a scanner and a thick cardboard envelope, walking up the brick path. I unlocked the deadbolt and pushed the door open to greet him. He handed me the electronic pad. He needed a signature for a piece of certified mail. I signed my name with my fingertip, took the parcel, and thanked him. I walked back to my office, examining the envelope. The return address belonged to a regional financial institution headquartered in New Orleans. The destination address was Rue and Route, but the recipient name printed on the adhesive label was Carlos Ortiz. A sharp knot formed in the center of my chest. My father had not maintained an office in this building, nor was he an employee. Receiving certified financial correspondence at my commercial address meant he had utilized my location for official documentation. Given the $18,000 he had already siphoned from my operating ledger, I did not hesitate. I did not consider federal privacy laws or the ethical boundaries of opening another person's mail. Those rules apply to functional families. In a war zone, you intercept the enemy's intelligence. I sat at my desk, grabbed a paring knife from my knife roll, and sliced the top of the cardboard envelope. I pulled out a thick stack of stapled paper. It was a uniform residential loan application, accompanied by a truth in lending disclosure statement. I spread the pages across my desk, sipping my coffee as my eyes scanned the dense blocks of text. I assumed this document related to the business account he had previously accessed. I expected to find an unauthorized line of credit taken against my kitchen equipment or a forged application for a commercial expansion loan. The reality resting on my desk proved infinitely more dangerous. The property listed on the collateral line was not my restaurant. It was a residential address, located in a quiet, affluent suburb of Baton Rouge. It was the 4-bedroom brick house with the wraparound porch and the sprawling oak tree in the front yard. It was the home where I grew up. My parents had taken out a second mortgage on their own house. I traced my index finger down the columns of numbers, dissecting the financial anatomy of their desperation. The loan amount was staggering. It was enough capital to lease a commercial warehouse, purchase industrial kitchen equipment, secure marketing firms, and float a payroll for a ghost kitchen startup for at least 6 months. They had extracted every ounce of equity they possessed, converting the roof over their heads into liquid cash to bankroll Nateo's empty warehouse. The terms of the loan were brutal. The interest rate bordered on predatory, structured with an adjustable variable that would spike after the first 12 months. It was the kind of financial instrument designed for borrowers who lacked fluid assets, a desperate gamble disguised as an investment. But the most chilling detail hid on page 3, under the borrower income verification section. To secure a loan of this size, a bank requires proof of substantial, steady income. My father had retired from commercial real estate 2 years ago, transitioning into a sparse consulting role that generated minimal revenue. My mother had not drawn a corporate salary in decades. On paper, they lacked the debt-to-income ratio required to qualify for this level of funding. I stared at the gross annual revenue figure typed into the application. The number was painfully familiar. It matched the exact gross revenue Rue and Root had generated in the previous fiscal year, down to the final decimal point. My father had committed federal mortgage fraud. He had submitted my proprietary profit and loss statements to the underwriter, claiming my restaurant's earnings as his own personal income. He leveraged his residual outdated status as a secondary signer on my old SBA loan to forge a narrative of ownership. He presented himself as the silent partner of a thriving Creole empire, using my grueling 80-hour work weeks to convince a loan officer he could afford the monthly payments on a high-risk second mortgage. I dropped the papers onto the desk. The air in my office suddenly felt thin. The stakes of this conflict had just shifted, expanding far beyond a sibling rivalry over a title or a stolen $18,000. My parents had strapped themselves to a ticking financial bomb, and they had handed the detonator to Mateo. I closed my eyes, rubbing the tension from my temples. I pictured my childhood home. I remembered the grooves in the hardwood floor where I used to slide in my socks, the smell of my mother's jasmine perfume in the hallway, the sound of rain drumming against the tin roof of the back patio. My parents owned that house outright, They had paid off the original mortgage years ago, securing a comfortable, stable retirement. Now they had wagered their entire sanctuary on the delusions of a son who had never successfully managed a single business venture in his life. Matteo needed Rue and Root to fail. He needed my supply chain to collapse, my staff to defect, and my patrons to abandon my dining room so he could swoop in, absorb my market share, and generate the revenue required to service this predatory loan. My parents backed his hostile takeover because they believed his success was guaranteed, provided I surrendered my assets to him. By changing the locks, securing the vendors, and tying my staff to profit-sharing contracts I had just severed, every lifeline Matteo possessed. He could not generate the cash flow needed to pay this mortgage. I had built a fortress to protect my livelihood, and in doing so, I had guaranteed the impending collapse of my parents' financial survival. If Matteo defaulted, the bank would foreclose on the house. They would lose everything. A cold, hollow realization settled into my bones. They had backed me into a corner where defending my own life meant participating in the destruction of theirs. The guilt they had trained me to carry flared up a familiar, toxic reflex, urging me to fix their mistakes. I could call the bank, untangle the fraud, and offer a settlement. I could bail them out one last time. I opened my eyes and looked at the fraudulent application again. The signature at the bottom of the page was crisp, confident, and unapologetic. My father knew exactly what he was doing when he forged this document. He weighed the risk of losing his home against the reward of crowning his son a CEO, and he decided my labor was the safety net that would catch them all. I picked up the loan application, placed it into a clear plastic sleeve, and filed it inside the encrypted drawer of my desk alongside the digital evidence of the social media smear campaign. I would not save them. You cannot rescue people who are actively trying to drown you. They chose to gamble their sanctuary on a mirage. They would have to endure the consequences of the desert. I finished my cold coffee, stood up from my desk, and walked back out to the dining room to begin the morning prep. The lunch rush was approaching, and I had a restaurant to run. The uneasy quiet held until early afternoon. The lunch service flowed smoothly, the dining room filled with the clatter of silverware and the low hum of business conversations. I was expediting tickets on the line when the front hostess walked into the kitchen, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. "A courier just dropped this off," she said, handing it to me across the stainless steel counter. "He said it requires your immediate attention." I wiped my hands on my apron and took the envelope. The return address belonged to a law firm located in a strip mall on the edge of town. It was not a prestigious corporate firm. It was the kind of office that handled slip-and-fall cases and messy divorces. I slid my thumb under the flap and pulled out a single sheaf of heavy bond paper. It was a formal cease and desist letter. The bold header demanded the immediate transfer of equity, threatening a lawsuit for breach of a verbal partnership. My father had decided to escalate the war from the shadows of bank fraud to the glaring light of the legal system. He thought the threat of a courtroom would finally break my resolve. He was about to discover that I was not afraid of a paper trail. I welcomed it. The physical letter rested on my stainless steel prep counter, absorbing the ambient heat of the kitchen. The cheap paper felt rough against my fingertips. The letterhead belonged to a firm operating out of a suburban strip mall, nestled somewhere between a discount mattress store and a brightly lit nail salon. The attorney, a man whose face frequently appeared on local bus benches, specialized in slip-and-fall injuries and minor traffic infractions. Now he was attempting to litigate corporate ownership. I traced the printed text with my index finger. The document asserted that my father provided ongoing advisory services and that Matteo contributed essential sweat equity to Rue and Root. Based on these fabricated contributions, they claimed a 50% equity stake in my limited liability company. They threatened to form a lawsuit for breach of a verbal partnership if I did not immediately surrender the keys and restore their financial access. The sharp aroma of diced shallots and simmering veal stock curled around me, anchoring me to the reality of my restaurant. I let out a dry, breathy laugh. Sweat equity. Mateo had never lifted a 50-pound sack of flour. He had never scrubbed a grease trap at 2 in the morning. His version of sweat equity involved wearing a tailored suit and ordering expensive bourbon on my tab. My father's advisory services consisted of sitting in my corner booth, taking credit for the ambiance I curated with my own capital. They assumed the mere threat of litigation would terrify me. They banked on the age-old dynamic where the daughter cowers to maintain the peace, handing over her hard-earned assets to avoid a public courtroom spectacle. I folded the cheap paper and slid it back into the envelope. I untied my apron, draped it over a chair, and grabbed my leather briefcase. I bypassed the escalating lunch service, trusting Elias to manage the line. The drive downtown took 20 minutes. I navigated the familiar Louisiana streets, the humid air rolling through the cracked car window. I was heading to a different caliber of legal representation. 3 years ago, when I signed the commercial lease for my building, I refused to use a generic online template. I hired a specialized corporate attorney. Miriam Gable operated out of a high-rise office overlooking the muddy expanse of the Mississippi River. She did not advertise on bus benches. She billed by the hour, wore immaculate gray suits, and possessed the warmth of a glacier. She was exactly the kind of person you want in your corner when predators begin to circle. I walked into her sterile, glass-walled conference room. Ms. Gable sat at the head of a polished granite table. I did not offer small talk. I opened my briefcase and laid the documents flat on the surface. First, the strip mall cease and desist letter. Second, the printed banking ledgers highlighting the $18,500 my father had stolen. Finally, the intercepted residential loan application detailing the forged commercial income. Ms. Gable picked up a silver pen. She read the cease and desist letter first. Her expression remained entirely neutral, her eyes scanning the paragraphs with practiced speed. The silence in the room was dense, broken only by the faint hum of the central climate control. She set the letter down and picked up the bank ledgers. She traced the wire transfers. Then she picked up the mortgage application. She spent a long time studying the gross annual revenue figure my father had fraudulently claimed as his own. She placed the pen on the table. The soft click echoed in the quiet room. "They have zero claim to equity," Ms. Gable stated, her voice flat and pragmatic. "A verbal partnership claim against a fully incorporated sole member limited liability company with a flawless paper trail is a joke. This attorney is throwing mud at the wall, hoping you flinch." "I am not flinching," I replied, meeting her steady gaze. "I want to shut this down. I want the door closed so tightly they break their hands trying to knock." Ms. Gable offered a tight, brief nod. "We are not going to offer a settlement. We are not going to invite them to mediation. Defending yourself against a baseless claim only grants the claim unearned legitimacy. We are going to go on the offensive." She pulled a legal pad toward her and began outlining the counterstrike. The strategy was brutal, efficient, and devoid of familial sentiment. Ms. Gable explained the mechanics of our response. We would issue a formal legal demand for the immediate return of the stolen $18,500. Because my father used a banking wire to move the funds across institutional lines for an unauthorized purpose, the act escalated beyond a simple civil dispute. "We are citing commercial wire fraud," Ms. Gable explained, writing the words in sharp, angular script. "We will give them 5 business days to restore the capital to your operating account. If they fail to comply, we bypass civil court and hand the ledgers directly to the district attorney." I felt a cold thrill resonate in my chest. The Ortizes were used to fighting with emotion, guilt, and loud dinners. They were entirely unprepared for a quiet, lethal legal mechanism. But the counterstrike did not end there. Ms. Gable tapped her pen against the fraudulent mortgage application. "This is the kill shot," she murmured. She explained that if my father and brother dared to file their frivolous lawsuit for breach of a verbal partnership, they would trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. In our response letter, Ms. Gable would explicitly state our intent to countersue for legal fees and punitive damages. More importantly, she would include a formal notice regarding the residential loan document. If they initiated a legal battle, we would be forced into the discovery phase. During discovery, we would subpoena all financial records, including the second mortgage. We will inform their attorney that the moment a lawsuit is filed, we are legally obligated to report the fraudulent income verification to the federal banking authorities, Ms. Gable said, looking directly at me. Your father lied to a federally insured institution to secure a loan. That is a felony. When the bank discovers the fraud, they will immediately call the loan due. Your parents will lose their home within 90 days. The gravity of her words settled over the granite table. The counter-threat was beautifully symmetric. My father tried to use the legal system to steal my business. We would use the legal system to guarantee his financial ruin if he took one more step forward. Draft the letter, I told her. Send it certified mail to the strip mall lawyer and send a copy directly to my parents' house. Miss Gable stood up, gathering the documents. It will go out by 5 o'clock today. I suggest you prepare yourself. When bullies realize their primary weapon is useless, they rarely surrender gracefully. They usually look for a softer target. I left the high-rise building and walked back to my car. The oppressive heat of the Louisiana afternoon wrapped around me, but my mind felt clear. The phantom weight of my family's expectations, the nagging guilt of the dutiful daughter, had been excised by the sharp scalpel of commercial law. I had drawn a boundary made of reinforced steel. They could not touch my lease. They could not claim my equity. They could not use a cheap lawyer to intimidate me. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The air conditioning blasted against my face. Ms. Gable was right. Mateo would not simply accept defeat. His ego was too fragile, and his financial desperation was too profound. The ghost kitchen warehouse he rented was sitting empty. The stolen capital was burning a hole in his pocket, and the ticking clock of the predatory second mortgage was growing louder. If he could not defeat me on paper, and he could not breach the physical doors of my kitchen, he would have to find another way to operate. He needed talent. He needed people who actually knew how to run a hospitality venue. He needed my people. I put the car in gear and drove back toward Rue and Route. The dinner rush was approaching. I knew exactly where Mateo would strike next, and I knew he was walking into a trap he could not possibly comprehend. The legal machinery began to turn in the background. The certified letter, drafted by Miriam Gable, was currently navigating the postal system, carrying a payload of commercial wire fraud accusations toward my father. Inside Rue and Route, the atmosphere remained strictly culinary. It was Friday afternoon. The weekend rush loomed ahead, bringing a surge of reservations and high expectations. I stood near the expo line, reviewing the daily inventory manifest and checking the temperature logs for the walk-in coolers. Elias, my sous chef, stood beside me inspecting a fresh delivery of Gulf shrimp. He was a man of few words, bearing forearms covered in burn scars and a meticulous dedication to Creole technique. He had been with me since the day I opened the doors. He started as a line cook and earned his title through grueling, flawless execution. Camille, the general manager, operated the front of house with the precision of an air traffic controller. She handled the reservation book, the wine inventory, and the temperamental local food critics with effortless grace. Together, they formed the structural pillars of my daily operations. I trusted them with my livelihood. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the familiar lull between lunch and dinner settled over the dining room. Elias wiped down his cutting board, sanitizing the stainless steel surface. Camille closed the leather-bound host ledger and stretched her shoulders. It was their scheduled window to step outside, catch their breath, and drink a cup of coffee before the Friday evening onslaught began. They exited through the newly secured rear-loading door, stepping into the humid Louisiana heat. They walked toward the corner coffee stand down the block. A silver sedan idled next to the curb, its engine humming quietly. The motor cut off, and the driver's side door swung open. Mateo stepped onto the pavement. He wore dark sunglasses and a tailored blazer projecting the image of a successful executive holding court. He had parked across the street, waiting for this exact moment. He knew my schedule, and he knew when my senior staff took their breaks. He intercepted them on the sidewalk before they could reach the cafe. He flashed his signature charismatic smile, the same expression that usually charmed bank managers and gullible investors. He invited them to sit on a nearby concrete bench. Elias and Camille exchanged a brief, skeptical glance, but remained standing, their arms crossed over their chests. Mateo launched into his rehearsed pitch. He did not mince words. He painted a grim portrait of my restaurant. He told them Rue and Root was drowning in internal litigation and financial instability. He spun a narrative where I was an erratic, sinking captain driving the ship straight into bankruptcy. He leaned in, lowering his voice, adopting the tone of a conspirator, offering a golden parachute to a doomed crew. He announced he was launching Apex Strategic Partners, a regional holding company designed to revolutionize the local ghost kitchen market. He claimed he possessed significant capital backing and an aggressive expansion plan. He needed a culinary director and an operations manager to lead the charge. He looked at Elias and offered a 50% salary increase. He looked at Camille and promised the title of Vice President of Hospitality. Then he delivered his closing argument. He offered them equity. He promised them a ground floor stake in an empire that would soon eclipse my single, struggling location. This was the pinnacle of dramatic irony. Mateo stood on a hot sidewalk, peddling fabricated equity in a non-existent company funded by stolen money. He assumed Elias and Camille were underpaid, overworked, and desperate for validation. He projected his own shallow desires onto them, believing loyalty was a commodity purchased with empty titles and cheap promises. He did not know about the cream-colored folders sitting in their lockers. He did not realize that just 3 days prior, I had restructured my entire payroll. Elias and Camille were not mere employees seeking an exit strategy. They held binding, notarized profit-sharing contracts. They already owned a tangible, legal percentage of a highly successful, fully operational restaurant. They knew exactly who paid their healthcare stipends, who covered their holiday bonuses, and who actually stood in the trenches with them during a 200-cover dinner service. Elias listened to the entire pitch without changing his expression. He let Mateo exhaust his vocabulary of corporate buzzwords and hollow guarantees. Then, Elias let out a sharp, resonant laugh. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a deep, genuine sound of amusement that echoed off the brick walls of the adjacent buildings. Mateo stiffened. His charismatic smile faltered. He adjusted his blazer, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through his polished veneer. Elias stepped closer, towering over my brother. "You want me to leave a kitchen that runs like a Swiss watch to go cook in a rented warehouse for a guy who does not even know how to properly sharpen a chef knife?" Mateo opened his mouth to defend his culinary vision, but Camille cut him off. Her tone was sharp and unforgiving. "We know about the wire transfers, Mateo. We know you are funding this little fantasy with stolen operating capital. You cannot even afford to buy your own seafood without forging documents." The color drained from Mateo's face. He realized his secret was exposed. His illusion of power evaporated into the thick southern air, revealing the desperate, hollow reality underneath. Elias delivered the final blow. "I already have equity in a real empire. My boss gave it to me on paper legally because I earned it. You are offering us imaginary shares in a sinking ship you built with someone else's money. Do not come near my kitchen again." Elias and Camille turned their backs on him and walked toward the coffee stand, dismissing him entirely. Mateo stood frozen on the sidewalk. The humiliation radiated from his posture. He had assumed his charm and his gender gave him inherent authority over my staff. He discovered that true leadership is forged through mutual respect and shared labor, not inherited entitlement. You cannot poach loyalty from a team you have never served. Mateo retreated to his silver sedan. He slammed the door and sped away, the tires screeching against the asphalt. He drove away with nothing. His physical siege had failed. His supply chain sabotage had failed. His attempt to trigger a staff mutiny had resulted in a spectacular, crushing rejection. 10 minutes later, Elias and Camille returned to the restaurant. They walked into my office, holding their iced coffees. Camille shut the door. They recounted the entire interaction on the sidewalk. They described Mateo's desperate pitch, his hollow promises, and the profound satisfaction of laughing in his face. I sat at my desk, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. The fortress I had built was holding strong. My perimeter was secure, my vendors were protected, and my team proved their unshakable loyalty. I thanked them, acknowledging their integrity, and sent them back to the floor to prepare for the dinner rush. However, the satisfaction was brief. As I reviewed the reservation book, the strategic reality of the situation settled back in. Mateo was running out of options. His ghost kitchen was an empty shell. He had no inventory and no personnel. The predatory second mortgage my parents took out was still ticking, demanding a monthly payment he could not produce. When a predator exhausts all direct avenues of attack, they look for an unguarded flank. Mateo needed cash. He needed a product he could sell immediately without requiring a full kitchen staff or daily wholesale deliveries. He needed something highly marketable, possessing immediate brand recognition. My eyes drifted toward the stainless steel prep tables visible through the office window. Sitting in a row of glass jars was my signature creation. The Louisiana hot honey glaze. It was a proprietary recipe I had spent months developing, finding a perfect balance of local sugarcane fermented chili and dark amber honey. It was the defining flavor profile of Ruin Root, beloved by patrons and frequently mentioned in local food reviews. I realized Mateo's next move before he even executed it. If he could not steal the restaurant, he would try to steal the recipe. The crushing rejection on the sidewalk left my brother with a rented, vacant warehouse and an evaporating timeline. The fraudulent residential loan my father orchestrated demanded a monumental monthly installment, a financial obligation ticking louder with each passing day. Mateo required immediate capital. He could no longer rely on a long-term hospitality strategy, primarily because he possessed neither the talent nor the workforce to execute one. He needed a tangible product, something he could monetize instantly without enduring the grueling hours of a commercial kitchen. He found his target sitting in pristine glass jars, lining the display shelves near my hostess stand. The signature element of my menu, the culinary anchor that tied my dishes together, was a proprietary Louisiana hot honey glaze. I spent 8 agonizing months perfecting the formula. It demanded a precise equilibrium of raw, dark amber nectar, sourced from local apiaries, infused with fermented cayenne peppers, toasted coriander, and a subtle whisper of smoked hickory. The condiment elevated my fried chicken, glazed my roasted root vegetables, and garnered glowing reviews in regional Epicurean magazines. It was highly marketable, universally beloved, and intrinsically tied to my brand identity. Customers routinely purchased 3 or 4 jars at a time after finishing their meals, proving its viability as a standalone retail commodity. A man devoid of original ideas will invariably attempt to plagiarize the brilliance of those around him. Matteo recognized the retail potential of the glaze. However, he possessed zero comprehension of the intricate reduction process required to yield a single batch. He could not manufacture the sauce himself. Instead, he chose a route of breathtaking, lazy audacity. He dispatched a hired courier to purchase 3 dozen jars directly from my front counter during a busy weekend service, acting as an ordinary patron buying artisanal merchandise. Once he secured the physical product, Matteo systematically stripped my custom branding from the glass. He applied a cheaply designed, generic label bearing the logo of his fictitious holding company, Apex Strategic Partners. Armed with my actual culinary creation masquerading as his own prototype, he scheduled meetings with purchasing managers at 3 prominent upscale grocery chains operating throughout the Gulf South. Once he secured the physical product, Matteo systematically stripped my custom branding from the glass. He applied a cheaply designed generic label bearing the logo of his fictitious holding company, Apex Strategic Partners. Armed with my actual culinary creation masquerading as his own prototype, he scheduled meetings with purchasing managers at 3 prominent upscale grocery chains operating throughout the Gulf South. He presented them with samples, weaving a charismatic narrative about artisanal production and aggressive regional scaling. He projected the image of a seasoned entrepreneur ready to disrupt the condiment aisle. Retail grocery buyers are perpetually hunting for the next lucrative, locally sourced sensation. Tasting the complex, undeniable quality of my honey, they eagerly agreed to introductory contracts. Matteo secured thousands of dollars in guaranteed pre-sales based entirely on the flavor profile I authored. He intended to take those purchase orders to an industrial co-packing facility, leveraging the guaranteed retail revenue to fund a mass production run, bypassing the arduous phase of product development entirely. He assumed recipes were merely lists of ingredients floating freely in the public domain, ripe for the picking. He fundamentally misunderstood the modern landscape of food commerce. During my second year of operation, long before the dining room achieved critical acclaim, I recognized the immense value of my intellectual property. I did not rely on family loyalty or gentleman agreements to protect my assets. I hired a specialized trademark attorney. We filed comprehensive documentation with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. We legally protected the specific formulation, the brand nomenclature, and the distinct trade dress of the packaging. The hot honey was not merely a sauce. It was a federally registered fortified corporate asset protected by federal law. My discovery of his scheme did not come from an emotional confession or a dramatic family confrontation. It arrived via a sterile, automated email alert. Ms. Gable, my relentless corporate counsel, maintained a digital trademark watch service designed to monitor regional commerce filings for any potential infringement against my portfolio. The software flagged a newly registered vendor application submitted to a prominent Louisiana grocery syndicate. The application listed a spicy honey condiment, and the corporate entity attached was Apex Strategic Partners. I sat in my office, reading the alert forwarded by Ms. Gable. The sheer laziness of his strategy provoked a dry, humorless laugh. He was trying to sell my own blood and sweat back to the very city where I built my reputation. He truly believed his gender and his tailored suits insulated him from the consequences of theft. I immediately dialed Ms. Gable's direct line. I did not ask her to negotiate. I instructed her to dismantle his retail network with extreme prejudice. Ms. Gable did not bother sending a polite warning to my brother. A cease and desist letter directed at a desperate man is often ignored until it is too late. To truly neutralize a threat in the retail sector, you must attack the distribution channels. Within 2 hours, Ms. Gable drafted comprehensive, unyielding legal notices. She attached my certified federal trademark registration numbers, the copyright filings for the recipe formulation, and a stark summary of the commercial wire fraud accusations currently pending against the Ortiz family. She dispatched these devastating dossiers via overnight courier directly to the corporate legal departments of the 3 grocery chains Mateo had approached. She sent an identical package to the general manager of the prominent co-packing facility he intended to use for mass production. The letters clearly delineated that anyone engaging in the manufacture, distribution, or sale of the infringed product would be named as co-defendants in a monumental intellectual property lawsuit. The corporate response was swift, decisive, and entirely unsentimental. Major retail syndicates harbor zero tolerance for intellectual property disputes, as the liability risks are astronomical. The purchasing managers who had enthusiastically shaken Mateo's hand just days prior immediately severed all communication. They canceled the presale contracts, nullified the purchase orders, and permanently blacklisted Apex strategic partners from their vendor networks. Buyers do not risk their valuable shelf space on unproven vendors carrying the stench of pending litigation. The co-packing facility went a step further. They halted his onboarding process and issued a demand for the non-refundable administrative fees he had incurred during his initial consultation, leaving him with a heavy invoice for services he could no longer utilize. Mateo was instantly excommunicated from the regional retail market. He found himself standing in his empty, cavernous warehouse, holding a box of plagiarized sauce he could never legally sell. He possessed 0 distribution avenues, 0 manufactured product, and a rapidly compounding mountain of debt. His attempt to hijack my intellectual property effectively euthanized his phantom corporation before it could even draw its first breath of legitimate revenue. His arrogance led him directly into a legal wood chipper. The fortress I constructed around my livelihood proved impenetrable. I had successfully defended my physical building, my supply chain, my personnel, and my intellectual property. I systematically stripped away every avenue of attack, leaving the men of the Ortiz family cornered, humiliated, and financially suffocated. But desperation breeds a uniquely dangerous kind of audacity. My father, watching the impending collapse of his residential sanctuary and the spectacular ruin of his favored son, realized that fighting me in the realm of legitimate commerce was a lost cause. He could not outmaneuver my attorney, and he could not bypass my operational security. If he could not conquer my business through normal channels, he would have to leverage the only weapon he had left. He would have to exploit the old, corrupt networks of his past, deciding to launch a direct, catastrophic strike against the very institution holding my money. It had been 7 days since the trademark enforcement eviscerated my brother and his retail ambitions. The oppressive August heat baked the asphalt outside Ruin Route, but inside my kitchen, the temperature felt entirely manageable. I was operating at peak efficiency. I had systematically severed every tentacle my family attempted to wrap around my livelihood. They were cornered. However, cornered predators are notoriously unpredictable. My father, Carlos Ortiz, was a man who built his identity on the illusion of control. The realization that his daughter possessed superior tactical acumen was a reality he simply could not digest. He needed to reassert dominance, and he chose the most archaic, patriarchal weapon available in the Southern business playbook. It was Tuesday morning, the designated day my automated payroll system processed the direct deposits for my staff. I sat in my office drinking a glass of iced chicory coffee, reviewing the upcoming weekend reservations. At exactly 10:15, my phone illuminated. It was a text message from Camille, my general manager. She asked if there was a glitch in the processing portal, noting her biweekly deposit had been rejected. 30 seconds later, Elias knocked on my doorframe, holding his phone, conveying a similar message. My stomach tightened. I pay my team with religious punctuality. I opened my commercial banking dashboard and entered my credentials. The loading wheel spun, and then a red banner materialized across the top of the screen. Account suspended. Temporary administrative hold. A hold on a commercial operating ledger is catastrophic. It halts vendor drafts, freezes utility payments, and paralyzes payroll. I dialed the dedicated corporate service number for the regional bank. The customer service representative sounded nervous, placing me on brief holds before finally transferring me to the local branch manager. The manager, a man named Bradley, answered the phone with a tone of forced paternal sympathy. Bradley and my father had played golf together at the Baton Rouge Country Club for 2 decades. They belonged to the same insular network of men who brokered deals over cigars and 18 holes. Bradley explained that Carlos had visited his office early that morning, expressing deep concern for my well-being. My father told Bradley the family was staging an intervention because I was experiencing a severe mental health crisis. He painted a picture of a hysterical, erratic daughter who was currently a danger to her own assets. Based solely on the hearsay of an unauthorized third party, Bradley had placed a discretionary freeze on my capital, claiming he was protecting the Ortiz family interests until I sought medical treatment. I did not yell at Bradley. I did not attempt to convince him of my sanity over the phone. Trying to prove your mental stability to a man who has already decided you are hysterical is a futile exercise. I ended the call and dialed Miriam Gable. I relayed the situation in crisp, objective terms. The attorney did not gasp or express outrage. She instructed me to gather my physical incorporation documents and meet her at the bank lobby in 20 minutes and let her do all the talking. I grabbed my leather briefcase, informed Elias I would return shortly, and drove downtown. The bank branch occupied a pristine, marble-floored building in the financial district. The air conditioning was frigid, smelling faintly of citrus polish and old paper. I pushed through the revolving glass doors and spotted Miss Gable waiting near the teller stations. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, clutching a slim leather portfolio. We did not exchange pleasantries. We walked in tandem toward the glass-walled office belonging to the branch manager. Through the transparent partition, I noticed a figure sitting in one of the plush waiting chairs just outside the office door. It was my father. He wore a crisp golf polo, legs crossed, reading a financial magazine. He looked up as we approached, a smug, victorious grin spreading across his face. He believed he had finally brought me to my knees. He expected me to beg for access to my own money. I did not break my stride. I walked past him as if he were a piece of generic lobby furniture. Miss Gable pushed open the door to the office without knocking. Bradley looked up from his computer, his smile faltering as he registered the presence of legal counsel. Miss Gable placed her portfolio on his desk. She did not sit down. She introduced herself, dropping her business card onto his keyboard. She laid out my articles of organization, the operating agreement, and a printed copy of the state banking regulations. She informed Bradley in a voice as cold and sharp as cracked ice that he had illegally frozen a commercial account belonging to a sole proprietor. She detailed how he had executed an administrative hold based on the unverified malicious gossip of a man who held zero legal authorization over the entity. Bradley stammered, attempting to hide behind his desk, citing bank policy regarding the protection of vulnerable clients. Ms. Gable cut him off. She explained that his internal policy did not supersede federal law. She informed him that because his unauthorized freeze had caused my payroll to bounce, he had exposed the branch to immense liability. She outlined her intent to file an immediate formal complaint with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Furthermore, she promised to name Bradley personally in a civil suit for tortious interference with a business contract, seeking damages for every bounced employee check and every delayed vendor payment. She looked at her watch. She gave him exactly 60 seconds to lift the hold before she initiated the filings. The color drained entirely from the manager's face. The camaraderie of the country club evaporated in the face of federal litigation and personal financial ruin. His hands shook as he reached for his computer mouse. He typed frantically, navigating the internal software interface. In less than 4 minutes, the red restriction vanished from my digital dashboard. My phone chimed with a push notification confirming the account was active. Miss Gable retrieved her documents, placed them back in her portfolio, and turned toward the door. We stepped out of the office and back into the waiting area. My father stood up, the smug grin wiped clean from his features. He looked at Bradley through the glass, seeking an explanation, but the manager refused to make eye contact, staring intently at his monitor. My father turned his gaze to me, his jaw working as he searched for the right words to reassert his dominance. He found none. I looked at him, feeling no anger, no sorrow, and no lingering attachment. He was just a desperate man, standing in a quiet lobby, realizing he had fired his final bullet and missed the target. I walked past him without saying a single word, stepping out into the blinding Louisiana sunlight. His ultimate weapon had failed, and now the crushing weight of his own financial decisions was about to pull him under. He had played every card he held, attempting to force my submission, oblivious to the fact that his reckless gamble was already unraveling. The predatory residential loan he had forged was ticking, and without my restaurant to fund it, the inevitable collapse of the Ortiz patriarchy was merely days away. Stepping out of the air-conditioned bank lobby and into the searing Louisiana sunlight, I felt a distinct shift in the atmosphere. The heavy, oppressive weight of family obligation that had rested on my shoulders for 3 decades evaporated into the humid morning air. I drove back to my kitchen, tied my apron strings, and stepped onto the line. The rhythm of my restaurant enveloped me, the sear of cast iron, the rhythmic chopping of celery and bell peppers, the sharp scent of reduced wine. I was in my element, operating a profitable, legally fortified enterprise. For the Ortiz men, however, the clock had simply run out. The collapse did not happen overnight. Ruin rarely arrives like a lightning strike. It moves like a slow creeping tide, eroding the foundation until the entire structure crumbles under its own weight. Over the next 8 weeks, the reality of their isolation set in. I received the first piece of news regarding my brother through the tight-knit network of local commercial real estate. Mr. Landry, my steadfast landlord, visited the restaurant for his usual Tuesday evening bourbon. He sat at the polished copper bar, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. When I stepped out of the kitchen to greet him, he offered a knowing, quiet smile. He told me he had recently spoken with a colleague who managed an industrial park on the outskirts of the city. The warehouse Mateo had leased for his phantom corporate expansion was officially abandoned. Mateo had signed the commercial lease, relying on the assumption that my restaurant's operating capital would cover the monthly rent, the utility deposits, and the eventual build-out of a ghost kitchen. He signed personal guarantees, banking on stolen money that never arrived. When the first day of the month rolled around, his accounts were empty. The property management company did not care about his tailored suits or his charismatic elevator pitch. They cared about cleared funds. After 30 days of delinquency, they taped a formal eviction notice to the corrugated metal door. They padlocked the facility, seized the meager office furniture he had purchased on credit, and sent his file to a collection agency. His grand holding company died before serving a single plate of food. But the warehouse eviction was merely a precursor to a far more devastating financial reckoning. The incident inside the bank lobby triggered a chain reaction my father failed to anticipate. By bringing Miriam Gable into the branch and threatening federal litigation over the unauthorized account freeze we forced the institution to examine their internal risk exposure. Banks despise liability. The Regional Compliance Department initiated a comprehensive audit of every file connected to Carlos Ortiz. During that internal review, underwriters examined the recent residential loan application my father had submitted. They flagged the sudden, uncharacteristic spike in his reported income. Seeking to verify the numbers, the fraud department requested authenticated federal tax returns matching the gross annual revenue he claimed to earn. My father could not produce them. He could not provide a single legal document proving he owned the revenue generated by Rue and Root. The discovery of income fabrication on a federally insured mortgage application is a severe violation. The bank did not offer him a grace period. They did not invite him to the country club to negotiate over cigars. They executed a standard acceleration clause. They called the entire note due immediately, demanding full repayment of the loan principal within 30 days, threatening foreclosure and criminal referral if he failed to comply. He had gambled his sanctuary on the sexist delusion that his son was destined for greatness, assuming his daughter would perpetually fund the safety net. The safety net was gone. To satisfy the bank and avoid the public humiliation of a foreclosure auction, my parents were forced to liquidate their assets at a staggering loss. They listed my childhood home well below market value, seeking a desperate cash buyer. One Tuesday afternoon, during the quiet lull between the lunch and dinner service, I drove my car through my old suburban neighborhood. I parked across the street from the property. The sprawling oak tree cast long shadows over the manicured lawn. The wraparound porch where I used to sit and shell peas for Sunday dinners looked exactly the same. But planted firmly in the front yard was a wooden real estate sign bearing a red banner reading, "Sold." A moving truck sat idling in the driveway. I watched through my tinted window as hired movers carried familiar pieces of furniture out the front door. My parents were downsizing to a cramped two-bedroom apartment located near the interstate, a drastic departure from the affluent comfort they had enjoyed for decades. I watched my mother walk down the front steps, carrying a cardboard box, her shoulders hunched. My father stood near the curb, looking older, smaller, and stripped of the arrogant posture that defined his entire existence. I felt a brief, hollow pang in my chest, a residual echo of the daughter who once craved their affection. But the feeling vanished, replaced by the cold logic of self-preservation. I put the car in gear and drove away. I did not stop. I did not offer a loan. You cannot rescue people from a burning building when they are the ones holding the match. The loss of the family home finalized the ruin, but the ultimate poetic justice found Mateo a few weeks later. Drowning in personal debt from the broken commercial lease, the failed co-packing contracts, and maxed-out credit cards, Mateo faced a harsh reality. His silver sedan was repossessed in the middle of the night. He could no longer rely on our parents for a bailout, as they were struggling to meet the rent on their new apartment. He needed a wage. He needed cash to survive. He discovered that the corporate sector requires actual credentials, verifiable experience, and a track record of success. His resume consisted of 3 failed startups and a mountain of unpaid vendor invoices. Every tech firm and logistics company in Baton Rouge rejected his applications. The only industry perpetually hiring, the only sector willing to accept a desperate man with no references, was hospitality. October brought a crisp chill to the Louisiana air. I received an invitation to a soft opening for a new bustling brasserie located in the downtown arts district. The chef was an old culinary school classmate, and I attended to show my support. The restaurant featured a sprawling open-concept kitchen, allowing the patrons sitting at the polished zinc bar to watch the brigade execute the menu. I sat at the chef's counter sipping a glass of dry white wine, observing the frantic, synchronized dance of the line cooks. My eyes drifted toward the back of the kitchen near the dish pit, where the lowest rung of the culinary hierarchy operates, the prep station. Standing over a stainless steel sink, wearing a generic, oversized white uniform, was my brother. He wore a stained canvas apron. His hair was tucked beneath a mandatory health department cap. He held a cheap plastic-handled knife, methodically working his way through a 50-pound sack of yellow onions. The pungent acidic fumes rose from the cutting board, stinging his eyes. I watched him wipe a tear from his cheek, using the back of his forearm, his shoulders aching from the repetitive, grueling labor. He was performing the exact manual tasks he had spent his entire life avoiding. He was enduring the heat, the physical exhaustion, and the low wages of the very industry he had arrogantly dismissed as beneath his intellect. The man who stood in my dining room, wearing a tailored suit, attempting to steal my title and crown himself a chief executive officer, was now chopping onions for minimum wage. He paused, resting his knife on the board, and looked out across the dining room. His gaze swept over the patrons, scanning the crowd, until his eyes locked onto mine. I sat perfectly still, holding my wineglass. I did not smile. I did not offer a look of pity or a gesture of triumph. I simply held his gaze, allowing the profound disparity of our positions to settle between us. I was a respected proprietor sitting in the dining room. He was a laborer trapped in the trenches, bound to the very work he once expected me to perform for his benefit. Matteo broke the eye contact first. He lowered his head, picked up his knife, and returned to peeling the onions. He possessed nothing left to steal, no false narrative left to spin, and no safety net left to catch him. He was finally forced to earn his own survival. I turned my attention back to my colleague expediting plates on the line, feeling a deep, unshakable sense of peace. The battle was over. The Ortiz patriarchy had collapsed under the weight of its own unearned entitlement, leaving me standing in the center of the empire I built with my own two hands, ready to define my own legacy. The 4 months following the collapse of the Ortiz patriarchy were the most intensely focused period of my professional life. The air inside Rue and Root felt different. The ambient tension, that invisible, lingering expectation that I needed to constantly prove my worth to ghosts who were never satisfied, had completely dissipated. I was no longer cooking to earn a seat at a table that did not exist. I was cooking to expand my own empire. We closed out the fourth quarter with the highest profit margin the restaurant had ever recorded. The dining room operated at full capacity 6 nights a week, buoyed by a glowing review in a prominent Southern culinary publication that specifically highlighted my proprietary Louisiana hot honey glaze. I sat in my office on a brisk Tuesday morning, the sunlight filtering through the window, reviewing the quarterly balance sheets. The numbers were not just good, they were foundational. They represented unshakable security. I signed the authorization forms to officially expand our outdoor patio, adding 12 new tables and a custom-built fire pit. It was an expansion funded entirely by operating revenue, requiring 0 commercial loans and 0 family guarantors. I called Elias and Camille into the office. I handed them their quarterly profit-sharing checks. I did not make a grand theatrical speech about loyalty or family. I simply thanked them for their flawless execution and handed them the envelopes. They took the checks, their expressions a mix of quiet pride and profound professional satisfaction. They had bet on the right captain, and the ship was sailing smoothly. But the most significant victory arrived via a certified letter from Miriam Gable. Following the disastrous end of Mateo's ghost kitchen, Ms. Gable had quietly resumed negotiations with the 3 regional grocery syndicates. She presented them with my certified trademark documentation and offered them the exclusive retail rights to the authentic Rue and Root hot honey. The buyers, recognizing the undeniable quality of the product and the clarity of the legal ownership, eagerly drafted new vendor contracts. The first massive pallets of bottled hot honey bearing my registered trademark and my custom label design were currently sitting in a legitimate, bonded co-packing facility, awaiting distribution across the Gulf South. The revenue stream generated by the retail launch would effectively double the annual income of my limited liability company. I routed all the retail profits into a newly established commercial holding account. The signature card for that account held only one name: Audrey Ortiz. There were no secondary signers, no legacy authorizations, and no backdoor access points. The vault was sealed, and I held the only key. My personal life mirrored the clarity of my professional operations. The silence from my family was absolute. My parents were currently navigating the cramped reality of their new 2-bedroom apartment. They were adjusting to a budget dictated by a fixed retirement income, stripped of the unearned luxury they had previously enjoyed. Mateo was locked into the grueling reality of a minimum wage prep cook, forced to trade his tailored suits for a stained apron and a pile of unpeeled onions. I did not reach out to them. I did not send a holiday card, and I did not offer a small anonymous loan to ease their transition. Establishing boundaries requires absolute discipline. You cannot demand respect and simultaneously fund the people who disrespect you. The extended family, however, began to slowly recalibrate their alliances. The relatives who had loudly condemned me during Mateo's viral smear campaign witnessed the rapid, undeniable implosion of his business ventures. They saw the foreclosure signs on my parents' house. They watched my restaurant thrive while the golden child sank. The objective reality of the situation eroded the fabricated narrative my family had spun. I received occasional, cautious text messages from cousins and aunts. They offered vague apologies, claiming they had been misled or misunderstood the complexities of the situation. I accepted their apologies with polite, distant brevity. I did not invite them to the restaurant for a welcome back dinner. I did not integrate them back into my inner circle. Trust is a currency that must be earned, and they had bankrupted their accounts during the opening salvos of the conflict. I kept the boundaries firm, allowing them to exist on the periphery of my life without granting them access to the core. It is now a late Tuesday afternoon. The restaurant is closed for the pre-shift transition. I am sitting alone in the center of the main dining room. The space is immaculate. The mahogany tables are perfectly aligned, adorned with crisp white linen napkins and polished silver flatware. The brass light fixtures cast a warm, inviting glow over the exposed brick walls. The ambient noise of the kitchen prep echoes faintly through the double doors, a comforting, rhythmic heartbeat. I look around this room, this empire I built from bare brick and a drained savings account. I trace the grain of the wood on the table in front of me. This space is no longer just a restaurant. It is a monument to resilience. It is the physical manifestation of undeniable earned competence. I look directly into the camera, leaning forward, wanting to ensure every word lands with absolute clarity. They did not want a daughter. They wanted an employee they did not have to respect. They wanted a utility, a silent engine to power the extravagant delusions of a son who possessed ambition but lacked the discipline to achieve it. They assumed my gender and my familial loyalty bound me to a lifetime of servitude. Establishing boundaries does not make you cruel. It makes you free. There is a profound societal expectation that family bonds are unbreakable, that blood dictates unconditional tolerance. We are taught to absorb the disrespect, to swallow the financial exploitation, and to keep the peace at all costs. We are told that walking away is an act of unforgivable selfishness. That is a lie, designed to protect abusers. You do not have to accept a supporting role in a family that refuses to recognize you as the main character of your own life. You do not owe your sanity, your assets, or your future to people who view your success merely as a communal resource to be harvested. If you are currently standing on that battlefield, if you are bleeding out to sustain a family dynamic that only values you for what you provide, I want you to hear this. Stop funding your own erasure. Secure your perimeter. Change the locks on your doors, both literally and metaphorically. The people who truly love you will respect a closed door. The people who rage against a boundary are the ones who are benefiting from your lack of one. Have you ever had to legally separate from family to save yourself? Have you ever had to draw a line in the sand and watch the people who claim to love you choose their own entitlement over your well-being? Share your story below. Let this space be a testament to the fact that you are not alone in this specific kind of grief, and you are not alone in this specific kind of victory. The Ortiz patriarchy collapsed because it was built on a foundation of unearned privilege and invisible labor. When I removed my labor, the entire structure fell. I did not destroy them. I simply stopped preventing their destruction. I stand up from the table, smoothing the front of my chef coat. The digital clock on the wall ticks closer to the opening hour. The host staff will arrive soon, unlocking the front doors to welcome the evening reservations. The kitchen is fully prepped, the line cooks are ready, and the hot honey glaze is simmering on the back burner. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for the people who refuse to grow is to lock the door and walk away. I turn and walk back through the swinging double doors, stepping into the heat and the noise of my kitchen, ready to command the line. The dinner service is about to begin, and the only legacy I am building tonight is my own. There is a pervasive myth in American culture, particularly within traditional family structures, that familial love is inherently unconditional. We are raised on a steady diet of holiday movies and societal expectations that dictate blood is thicker than water, that the family unit is a sacred institution where forgiveness is mandatory and support is inexhaustible. We are taught that parenting is an act of selfless devotion, a nurturing environment where children are guided with fairness, honesty, and emotional awareness. However, as the story of Audrey Ortiz so painfully illustrates, the reality of family dynamics can sometimes be a stark departure from this idealized vision. In some families, love is not unconditional, it is transactional. And within these transactional structures, an insidious phenomenon often emerges: the creation of the utility child and the golden child. My reflection on Audrey's harrowing experience, and the echoes I hear in stories like Claire's, who was used as a financial safety net, and Jolene's, whose very home was stolen by those meant to protect her, has profoundly shifted my understanding of family responsibility and parenting values. It has forced me to confront a reality that is deeply uncomfortable, but undeniably necessary to acknowledge. In a healthy family, parents act as guides, fostering independence, accountability, and self-worth in their children. The goal is to raise individuals capable of navigating the world with integrity and resilience. But in a dysfunctional family, parents often act as resource managers, and their children are assigned roles based on their perceived utility. The golden child, like Mateo or Paige, is the designated heir. They are often shielded from the consequences of their actions, their failures reframed as temporary setbacks or the fault of circumstances beyond their control. They are praised not for their achievements, but for simply existing. Their role is to absorb resources, both financial and emotional, and in return, they provide the parents with a reflection of their own desired success or status. They are the fragile egos that must be protected at all costs. Conversely, the utility child, like Audrey Claire and Jolene, is the designated engine. They are the responsible ones, the high achievers, the ones who solve problems and pay the bills. They are the ones who cook the perfect Thanksgiving dinner or build a thriving restaurant from the ground up. However, their accomplishments are rarely celebrated for their own sake. Instead, their success is viewed as a communal asset, a reservoir to be tapped whenever the golden child falters or the family encounters a crisis. The tragedy of the utility child lies not just in the exploitation of their resources, but in the systematic erasure of their identity. They are conditioned to believe that their value is inextricably linked to their usefulness. They equate compliance with love, assuming that if they just work harder, achieve more, and solve enough problems, they will finally earn the unconditional affection and respect they crave. But that validation never comes, because to respect the utility child would require the parents to acknowledge their own exploitation. It would require them to dismantle the very system that sustains their preferred narrative. When Audrey's parents attempted to publicly gift her restaurant to her brother, they were not simply committing an act of staggering entitlement. They were enforcing the established hierarchy. They were asserting their belief that Audrey's labor and creative vision were merely raw materials, meant to be harvested and reassigned to the son who deserved the title. They expected her to quietly accept her demotion, because in their eyes she was not an autonomous individual. She was an extension of their will. The lessons here regarding parenting and long-term guidance are critical. Raising children with honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness means recognizing them as distinct individuals with their own rights, boundaries, and aspirations. It means holding them accountable for their actions, regardless of birth order or gender. It means understanding that true love does not involve enabling incompetence or exploiting competence. When parents fail to uphold these values, the consequences are devastating. They breed resentment, fracture sibling relationships, and cripple the golden child's ability to function independently in the real world. As we saw with Mateo and with Claire's sister Paige, when the safety net is finally removed, the fall is steep and inevitable. The most profound realization, however, belongs to the utility child. The moment of awakening, the moment Audrey changed the locks, the moment Claire canceled the rent transfer, the moment Jolene filed the restraining order, is a moment of agonizing liberation. It is the realization that the love they sought was a mirage, and that the only way to save themselves is to sever the ties that bind them to their exploitation. We are taught that setting boundaries with family is an act of cruelty. We are told that we are tearing the family apart or punishing innocent people when we refuse to continue funding the dysfunction. But this is the final manipulation. A boundary is not a weapon, it is a shield. It is a clear statement of what behavior you will no longer fund, hide, or accept. It is the act of replacing resentment with responsibility. As you reflect on these stories, I encourage you to follow Intimately Told Stories for more narratives that explore the complex, often hidden realities of human relationships. These stories challenge our preconceived notions and force us to examine the invisible scaffolding of our own lives. The truth is, family is not always a sanctuary, and loyalty should not require the sacrifice of your own sanity or livelihood. Sometimes the most loving decision you can make for yourself, and even for those who refuse to grow, is to stop rescuing them from the consequences of their own actions. Perhaps the greatest lesson is this: we do not owe our lives to the people who gave us life, especially if they demand we live it in their shadow. True freedom is the terrifying, exhilarating realization that the only permission you need to claim your own worth is your own. And sometimes, the only way to build a legacy that truly matters is to lock the door on the one you were expected to inherit.